My older brother, Greg, just bought a $1.2 million house. I know this because his wife posted dozens of pictures online this morning, bragging about the vaulted ceilings, the imported marble countertops, and the custom saltwater pool. They were popping expensive champagne on a pristine mahogany deck. Meanwhile, I am standing in a hallway that smells like industrial bleach and deep neglect, holding a squashed vanilla cupcake with a single candle for our mother. Today is her 78th birthday. My name is Travis. I am 35 years old, and I work as a mid-level logistics manager on the south side of the city. I clock in 60 hours a week, managing warehouse inventories, organizing freight schedules, and making sure truck drivers hit their routes on time. It is exhausting blue-collar management work, but it pays the rent on my small apartment and keeps my 10-year-old car running. I am not wealthy. I do not wear tailored suits. But I sleep soundly every single night knowing I earn my keep honestly. Greg cannot say the same. Our mother, Helen, is the reason either of us survived to adulthood. She was a force of nature. After our father passed away when I was just a boy, she worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over our heads. She scrubbed floors at a downtown office building before sunrise and served food in a hospital cafeteria until dark. She sacrificed her youth, her health, and her dreams, so Greg and I could have clean clothes, hot meals, and a chance at a better life. She gave everything she had to us. And this is how Greg repaid her. When Mom started showing signs of memory loss a few years ago, Greg swooped in like a vulture. He hired slick lawyers, claimed I was too broke to handle her care, and took complete legal control of her estate and medical decisions. He promised me he was moving her into a premier assisted living community. He lied. He dumped her in a grim state-run Medicaid facility on the edge of town. It is the kind of place people go when their families want to forget they exist. I walked down the flickering fluorescent hallway of the nursing home, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ache. The floor is covered in peeling linoleum that sticks to the bottom of my boots. A television blares a mindless game show from a common room where a dozen elderly people sit slumped in wheelchairs, staring blankly at the wall. Nurses rush past me, overworked and underpaid, completely ignoring the moans coming from the open doorways. This place is a warehouse for the dying. It is a prison for a woman who deserves a palace. I reach room 114 and push the heavy wooden door open. The contrast between my brother's new luxury mansion and this reality hits me like a physical punch to the gut. Mom is sitting in a windowless room. There is no natural light, only a single harsh bulb buzzing directly above her bed. The walls are painted a sickly, institutional green, and the air is heavy with the smell of stale urine and chemical cleaners. She is sitting in a worn, faded armchair in the corner, wearing a thin hospital gown covered by an old blue robe I bought her 5 years ago. She looks so frail. The strong, commanding woman who used to carry groceries for miles in the snow now looks like a stiff breeze could break her. Her silver hair is unbrushed, and she is staring at her own hands resting in her lap. I swallow the lump forming in my throat, force a warm smile onto my face, and step fully into the room. "Hey, Mama," I say softly, keeping my voice gentle so I do not startle her. "Happy birthday." She blinks slowly and turns her head toward me. For a second, her eyes are cloudy, lost in that terrible fog that comes and goes these days. Then a flicker of recognition sparks in her brown eyes. A weak, beautiful smile spreads across her wrinkled face. "Travis," she whispers, her voice raspy and thin. "My baby boy." I kneel beside her chair and set the small white bakery box on her bedside table. I take both of her hands in mine. Her skin is paper-thin cold to the touch. I kiss her knuckles and rest my forehead against her fingers. I hate seeing her like this. It takes everything in me not to break down and cry, but I know I have to be strong for her. "I brought you a cupcake, Mama," I tell her, looking back up into her eyes. "Vanilla with the pink frosting. Just the way you like it. I even brought a candle. We are going to make a wish today." She nods slowly, her gaze drifting toward the bakery box. But as I hold her hands, my thumb brushes against her left ring finger. I freeze. I look down at her hand. My heart drops into my stomach. Mom's vintage wedding ring is missing. That ring was her most prized possession. It was a simple 14-karat gold band with a tiny, imperfect diamond that our father bought from a pawn shop back in 1968. It was not worth much money to anyone else, but to her, it was priceless. She never took it off. She wore it when she scrubbed those office floors. She wore it when she cooked our dinners. She swore to me she would wear it to her grave. Mama? I say, my voice suddenly sharp with panic. Where is your ring? Her eyes snap down to her bare finger. The pale indent where the gold band sat for over 50 years is still clearly visible on her skin. Suddenly, the fog in her mind completely evaporates. Helen is terrified and frail, but in this exact moment, she possesses a moment of sharp, crystal-clear clarity. Her breathing quickens. She pulls her hands away from mine and grips the armrests of her chair. Her eyes dart around the windowless room as if someone is hiding in the shadows, waiting to attack her. He took it, she whispers, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and sudden, vivid anger. Who took it, Mama? I ask, my blood turning to ice. Did one of the nurses take it? Tell me who did it, and I will tear this place apart right now. No, she says, grabbing my wrist with a strength that completely shocks me. Not the nurses. Your brother. Greg was here yesterday. He told me I did not need it anymore. He pulled it right off my finger, Travis. He just pulled it right off. A blinding wave of pure rage washes over me. Greg. My own flesh and blood, the man who just closed on a $1.2 million house, came to a miserable Medicaid facility and stripped our mother of her wedding ring. He robbed the woman who gave him life. He crossed a line that I did not even know existed. I stand up, my fists clenched so tight, my fingernails dig into my palms. I am going to kill him. I am going to drive to his massive new house, drag him out by his designer collar, and make him beg for forgiveness. Travis, stop, Mom says. Her voice is no longer frail. It is the firm, authoritative tone she used when we were kids, the tone that commanded absolute respect. I look down at her. She is sitting up straighter now. The confusion that usually clouds her face is entirely gone, replaced by a fierce, burning determination. Go lock that door, she commands. I hesitate for a second, stunned by her sudden lucidity, but I do as I am told. I walk over to the heavy wooden door, push it shut, and turn the deadbolt. The loud click echoes in the small, oppressive room. I walk back over to her chair and kneel down again. What is it, Mama? I ask. She reaches trembling fingers into the deep pocket of her old blue robe. She fumbles for a moment, her knuckles white with effort. Slowly, she pulls a heavily folded, thick document from the lining of the robe. The paper is worn at the edges, clearly handled many times, and covered in dense legal text. What is this? I ask, staring at the folded pages. She presses the document into my hands. I prepared this secretly, months ago. She says, her voice steady and low, back when my mind was still sharp every single day, back before the fog started coming in so thick. I knew Greg was changing. I saw the greed taking over his heart. I knew he was going to put me somewhere like this, and I knew he was going to try to take everything. I unfold the pages carefully. My eyes scan the legal jargon. It is a comprehensive power of attorney and healthcare proxy agreement, but it is different from the one Greg forced her to sign. This one has an official gold seal on the bottom. I had my old friend Martha bring a notary public to the house. Before Greg sold it, Mom explains, watching my face as I read. We did it while Greg was out of town on one of his fancy business trips. I told the notary I needed to secure my future. The document revokes every single right Greg has over my life, my health, and my finances. I stare at the paper, completely speechless. Even as her mind was slipping, she had the foresight to protect herself. She had orchestrated a silent rebellion right under my arrogant brother's nose. But it is not finished yet, she says, tapping the bottom of the last page with her index finger. It needs my final signature and today's date to be fully activated and legally binding. Give me your pen, Travis. I reach into my uniform shirt pocket and pull out my black ink pen. My hands are shaking as I hand it to her. Mom takes the pen with absolute purpose. She spreads the thick document out across her lap, smoothing down the creases with her palm. She demands my pen and she signs it. Her handwriting is slightly shaky, but the signature is unmistakable. Helen Marie Vance. She dates it clearly, today's date, her 78th birthday. With that single stroke of black ink, she makes me her sole legal proxy. She overrides Greg's previous arrangements completely. She strips him of his authority, his control, and his power over her life. She hands the pen back to me and folds the document carefully. She presses it flat against my chest, right over my heart, and looks deep into my eyes. "Take this to the bank. First thing tomorrow morning, Travis." She says, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Do not tell him. Do not warn him. You hit him where it hurts. You take back control. You are a good man, my son. You always have been. Do not let him destroy what I built." I grip the document tightly in my hand. The weight of the paper feels heavier than steel. I look around the windowless room at the peeling paint, the harsh light, and the terrible conditions my brother forced our mother to endure. And then I look at her bare left hand, stripped of its dignity, for absolutely no reason other than pure, unadulterated greed. "I promise you, Mama," I whisper, my voice thick with a rage that I can no longer contain. "I am going to fix this. I am going to get your ring back, and I am going to make him pay for every single second you spent in this room." I fold the document and slide it deep into my inside jacket pocket, pressing it flat against my ribs. I stand up, lean down, and kiss her forehead. I walk over to the small table light, the single candle on the squashed vanilla cupcake, and bring it over to her. She closes her eyes, takes a deep breath, and blows the candle out. I unlock the door and step out of the room, leaving the cupcake on her table. As I walk back down the bleak, bleach-scented hallway, the sorrow I felt earlier is completely gone. There is no sadness left in my body. There is only a cold, calculated fury. Greg thinks he is untouchable. He thinks his money, his connections, and his brand new mansion make him a king. He thinks I am just a poor logistics manager who will bow down and accept his scraps. He is wrong. I took my mother's ring, but he just handed me the keys to his absolute destruction. Tomorrow morning, the game changes forever. The heavy glass doors of the Medicaid facility slammed shut behind me. The sound echoed in the empty concrete courtyard. I stepped out into the blinding afternoon sun. The heat radiating off the cracked asphalt hit my face, but I barely felt it. My blood was completely frozen. My chest was tight. Every single muscle in my body coiled with a rage I had never experienced before. Inside my jacket pocket, resting flat against my ribs, was the thick legal document my mother had just signed. It felt like a loaded weapon. I kept my right hand pressed against it as I walked across the parking lot. I needed to feel the paper. I needed to remind myself that I had the power to end this nightmare. The parking lot was mostly empty. A few rusted sedans and dented minivans belonged to the overworked nursing staff, but sitting right in the middle of the visitor section, taking up 2 parking spaces, was a brand new Porsche Panamera. It was painted a sleek, aggressive midnight black. The paint job was so polished it mirrored the miserable gray building of the nursing home. The sheer audacity of parking a $100,000 sports car outside a state-run facility for the destitute made my stomach turn. Greg was leaning casually against the driver's side door. My older brother looked like he had just stepped out of a luxury lifestyle magazine. He wore a tailored navy blue suit that probably cost more than my car. His hair was perfectly styled. He was checking something on his expensive smartphone, completely unbothered by the fact that he had just dumped the woman who gave him life into a windowless room smelling of bleach. Standing next to him was his wife, Chloe. Chloe was the absolute embodiment of everything fake and status-obsessed. She was wealthy white and looked at the entire world like it was something stuck to the bottom of her designer shoe. She wore an oversized pair of dark sunglasses, a crisp white linen dress, and held a leather handbag that cost enough to pay my rent for a year. She was tapping her manicured foot impatiently, clearly disgusted by the environment. I marched straight toward them. My heavy work boots slammed against the pavement. The sound made Greg look up from his phone. He did not look guilty. He did not look ashamed. He looked mildly annoyed. Travis Gregg sighed. His voice was smooth and practiced. "I thought you were supposed to be working your little warehouse shift today. Did they finally fire you, or did you just decide to take a break from lifting boxes?" Chloe let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She did not even bother to take off her sunglasses. She just crossed her arms and stared at me like I was a stray dog that had wandered too close to their expensive car. "Where is the ring?" I demanded. I did not yell. I did not scream. I kept my voice dangerously low. Greg blinked. He exchanged a quick, amused glance with Chloe. He slipped his phone into his suit pocket and stood up straight. He brushed a piece of imaginary lint off his lapel. "Excuse me," Greg asked, playing dumb. "Do not play games with me right now," I said, taking another step closer. The heat radiating from the Porsche engine washed over my shins. Mom's vintage wedding ring, the gold band with the small diamond. She told me you came into her room yesterday and pulled it right off her finger. Tell me you did not do it. Tell me she was just confused. Greg rolled his eyes. He let out a long, dramatic sigh. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Travis. You are being completely hysterical over nothing. Yes, I took the ring. What exactly is the problem?" My vision actually blurred for a second. The absolute casualness in his voice felt like a physical blow. "You stole our mother's wedding ring. You walked into her room, took advantage of a frail elderly woman, and stripped her of the one thing she cared about most in this world." "It is not stealing," Travis Gregg said condescendingly. "I am her legal guardian. I have complete power of attorney over her estate. That means her property is my responsibility. I decided the ring was a liability. She is in a nursing home surrounded by minimum wage workers. Someone was going to steal it eventually. I simply secured the asset." Secured the asset. I repeated the words, tasting like poison in my mouth. "It is her wedding ring. Dad bought it for her. She wore it every single day of her life. She loved that ring." "Oh, please," Chloe interrupted. Her voice was shrill and dripping with absolute disdain. "It was a cheap, ugly little band from a pawn shop. It had zero aesthetic value. It barely even looked like real gold. You are acting like it was some priceless family heirloom." Greg did her a favor. "She does not need it anymore. She barely even knows what day it is, Travis." I turned my eyes to Chloe. "Keep your mouth shut," I warned her. "This is between me and my brother." Greg stepped forward. His chest puffed out. "Do not speak to my wife that way, you pathetic loser. You have no right to come out here and make demands. You have contributed absolutely nothing to this family. You live in a cramped, moldy little apartment on the bad side of town. You drive a 10-year-old car that looks like it belongs in a junkyard. You are a mid-level logistics manager who barely scrapes by. You cannot even afford to take care of yourself. How on earth do you think you can dictate how I manage our mother? I manage her care because I am the successful one." Greg continued, his voice rising in volume. "I am the one who just closed on a $1.2 million house. I am the one with the business connections. I put a roof over her head when her mind started going. You dumped her in a Medicaid facility, I shot back. You told me you were putting her in a premium assisted living community. You lied to me. You put her in a place that smells like urine and death. You left her in a windowless room. Because that is what makes financial sense." Greg snapped. "I am not going to drain the estate paying for premium care when she does not even realize where she is. She gets fed. She gets a bed. That is all she requires. You are too emotional and too poor to understand how real wealth is managed." "What did you do with the ring?" Greg, I asked again. My hands were balled into fists so tight my fingernails were cutting into my palms. Greg smiled. It was a cold, cruel smile. I pawned it. The word hung in the hot summer air. "I pawned it. I sold it to a dealer downtown this morning," Greg said, looking incredibly pleased with himself. "I got $800 for it. I am putting the money into the estate management fund. It will help cover the legal fees I had to pay to secure my guardianship." "You should be thanking me, Travis. I am doing all the heavy lifting while you show up with a cheap cupcake and pretend to be the loving son." Chloe laughed again. She reached out and traced her manicured fingers over the smooth roof of the Porsche. "Exactly. Greg works so hard to keep everything afloat. And you just complain? It is honestly embarrassing, Travis. You are 35 years old and you have absolutely nothing to show for your life. No house, no money, no status. You are a failure. You should just walk away and let the adults handle the situation." I stared at the two of them. I looked at Greg in his tailored suit and Chloe with her designer bag. I looked at the luxury car they used to drive to a poverty-stricken nursing home. They were empty. They were completely hollow inside. They measured human dignity in dollars and cents. They looked at our mother and saw a financial burden that needed to be liquidated. I wanted to hit him. I wanted to grab Greg by his expensive lapels, slam him against the shiny black hood of his sports car, and beat the arrogance out of him. The urge was so strong it made my arms shake. But then my right hand pressed against my jacket pocket. The thick folded paper crinkled slightly against my chest. The document. The new power of attorney. The revocation of all Greg's rights. The secret weapon Mom had prepared for exactly this moment. If I assaulted him in the parking lot, I would be arrested. I would go to jail. Greg would press charges, ruin my life, and use my arrest as permanent proof that I was unfit to ever challenge him. He would win, I would lose everything, and Mom would be trapped in that windowless room forever. I forced my fists to unclench. I took a deep, steadying breath. I let the burning anger transform into ice-cold focus. "You are right," I said quietly. Greg raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me." "I said you are right," I repeated, keeping my voice perfectly flat. "You are the successful one, Greg. You have the big house. You have the fancy car. You have the beautiful wife. I am just a guy who works in a warehouse. I don't have millions of dollars. I don't know how to manage estates." Greg let out a short, triumphant laugh. He looked at Chloe and shook his head. "Well, I am glad you finally found some self-awareness, Travis. It takes a big man to admit when he is out of his depth." "Don't bother coming back here," Chloe added, opening the passenger side door of the Porsche. "You just upset her anyway. Leave the caregiving to people who actually know what they are doing." Greg walked around to the driver's side. He opened the door and looked at me over the roof of the car. "Go back to your little apartment, Travis. Go back to your little life. Let me handle the family business from now on. Understand?" I looked him dead in the eye. "I understand perfectly, Greg. Enjoy your new house." Greg smirked. He slid into the driver's seat and slammed the heavy door shut. The Porsche engine roared to life, a deep, aggressive growl that completely shattered the quiet of the parking lot. He put the car in gear and stepped on the gas. The tires screeched slightly on the pavement as he sped toward the exit. He did not look back. I stood alone in the empty parking lot. The smell of exhaust fumes mixed with the oppressive summer heat. My heart was pounding so hard, I could feel it in my throat. I pulled my hand out of my pocket. Greg thought he had won. He thought he had crushed me. He thought he had completely neutralized the only person in the world who actually cared about Helen Vance. He believed his money and his status made him invincible. He believed my modest income made me powerless. But he was wrong. He had no idea what was sitting inside my jacket. I walked to my 10-year-old sedan. The paint was peeling on the hood. The driver's side door creaked loudly when I opened it. The interior was boiling hot, and the air conditioning barely worked. I sat down on the worn fabric seat, pulled the thick legal document out of my pocket, and placed it carefully on the passenger seat. I stared at Mom's shaky signature at the bottom of the page. The notary seal glimmered in the sunlight. The date was fresh. Today's date. Greg had stolen her ring today, but tomorrow I was going to take everything from him. I started the engine. It sputtered for a moment before catching. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the Medicaid facility. I drove straight home to my small apartment on the south side. I did not turn on the television. I did not eat dinner. I sat at my small kitchen table, staring at the document under the dim overhead light. I read every single line of the legal text until I had it completely memorized. I learned exactly what rights I now possessed. I possessed absolute control. I barely slept that night. I lay in bed watching the shadows stretch across the ceiling, waiting for the sun to rise. I thought about the cold, windowless room. I thought about the missing gold band on my mother's finger. I thought about Chloe's mocking laughter and Greg's cruel smile. When the first light of dawn finally broke through my bedroom window, I got up. I put on my best suit. It was not a designer suit. It was an off-the-rack gray suit I bought 5 years ago for a friend's wedding. But it was clean, and it fit me well. I made a pot of black coffee, drank it standing up, and walked out the door. By 8:45 in the morning, I was standing on the concrete steps outside the First National Bank downtown. The large glass doors were locked. The gold lettering on the window proudly advertised wealth management and estate planning services. This was the bank where Greg kept all of Mom's accounts. This was the bank where Greg conducted his supposedly brilliant financial management. I held the folded document tightly in my right hand. The morning air was crisp, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the day before. People in business attire hurried past me on the sidewalk, holding briefcases and coffee cups, completely unaware of the absolute storm that was about to break. At exactly 9 o'clock, a security guard in a crisp uniform walked up to the glass doors from the inside. He turned the deadbolt with a loud click. He pushed the doors open and gave me a polite nod. "Good morning, sir," the guard said. "The bank is now open." I gave him a tight, polite smile. "Good morning," I replied. I stepped through the glass doors. The air conditioning inside the lobby was freezing. The floors were polished marble. The tellers were standing at attention behind their pristine counters. I did not walk toward the teller line. I walked straight toward the plush, carpeted area reserved for the bank managers and estate executives. I gripped the paper in my hand. Greg pawned my mother's ring because he thought she did not need it. He called me a pathetic loser because he thought I could not fight back. He was about to learn a very painful lesson. The game was over. The counter-strike was beginning right now. The polished marble floors of the First National Bank gleamed under the soft, recessed lighting of the ceiling. It was the kind of pristine, unblemished surface that always made me hyper-aware of the scuffs on my heavy work boots. I walked past the long line of regular customers, waiting for the tellers, and headed straight toward the back of the lobby. This area was sectioned off by thick frosted glass partitions and heavy mahogany desks. It was the wealth management department. It was a place designed to make people with money feel important, and people without money feel invisible. I did not belong here. The sharp scent of expensive cologne and freshly printed paper hung in the cold, air-conditioned breeze. But I kept my shoulders pulled back and my spine perfectly straight. I was not here to ask for a loan. I was not here to beg. I was here to take back what belonged to the woman who had sacrificed her entire existence for my brother and me. A young assistant in a crisp, tailored skirt suit intercepted me before I could reach the main corridor. She held a sleek digital tablet pressed against her chest and looked me up and down with practiced, professional disdain. Her eyes lingered on my slightly faded gray suit jacket. She smiled a tight, obligatory smile that did not reach her eyes. "Good morning, sir," she said smoothly. "Can I help you find something today?" "I need to speak with the estate manager assigned to the Helen Vance accounts," I replied. My voice was calm and steady. I kept my hand resting over the breast pocket of my jacket, where the thick folded document sat heavy against my chest. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, tapping her manicured fingernail against the edge of her tablet. "Mr. Sterling handles our high net worth estate planning. He is currently reviewing portfolios and normally requires at least a 2-week notice for any in-person consultations." "Tell Mr. Sterling this is a legal emergency regarding an active power of attorney," I said. I did not raise my voice, but I let the absolute certainty in my tone do the heavy lifting. "Tell him Travis Vance is here, and I have notarized documents that require immediate processing." She blinked twice, clearly unaccustomed to someone in an off-the-rack suit issuing direct orders in her lobby. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding slowly. She turned on her heel and walked down the carpeted hallway, her high heels clicking softly against the floor. I stood alone in the quiet waiting area. I looked at the expensive, abstract paintings hanging on the walls. They were nothing but splashes of meaningless color, probably bought for thousands of dollars to project an aura of sophistication. I thought about the windowless room at the Medicaid facility. I thought about the peeling paint on my mother's wall and the smell of bleach. 10 minutes later, a tall man with thinning silver hair and a dark custom suit emerged from one of the frosted glass offices. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and carried a leather-bound folder under his arm. He approached me with the exact same cautious skepticism the assistant had displayed. "Mr. Vance," the man asked, extending a pale hand. "I am Arthur Sterling. I manage the financial estate for Helen Vance. I must admit, your visit is highly unexpected. Your brother Greg is my primary point of contact for all matters regarding your mother." He was just in my office last week, finalizing some management transfers. I ignored his outstretched hand. Greg is no longer your point of contact, I said flatly. Arthur Sterling dropped his hand and his polite smile vanished. He stood up a little straighter, attempting to use his height and his expensive suit to intimidate me. "Excuse me," he said. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the document my mother had signed the day before. The paper was thick and heavy. The gold notary seal caught the light of the chandelier above us. I held it out to him. "This is a newly executed power of attorney and healthcare proxy," I explained. It was signed by Helen Vance and notarized legally. It completely revokes any and all previous proxies, guardianships, or financial control granted to Greg Vance. I am now the sole legal executor of her estate and her finances. I need you to update your records immediately and freeze all of her accounts to prevent any further unauthorized withdrawals. Sterling stared at the paper in my hand as if it were a venomous snake. He slowly reached out and took it. He opened the folds and his eyes darted across the legal text. I watched his face closely. I watched the initial annoyance shift into genuine surprise and then morph into deep, uncomfortable panic. He recognized the legal weight of the document instantly. The notary seal was flawless. The dates were current. The language was bulletproof. "This is highly unusual," Sterling muttered. His voice lost its smooth, polished edge. He looked up at me over the rims of his glasses. "Greg assured me he had full permanent guardianship due to your mother experiencing cognitive decline." "Greg lied to you," I said. "My mother has moments of extreme clarity, and she used one of them to secure her own protection against a son who was actively exploiting her. Now, are you going to process that document, or do I need to call the State Banking Commission and report this branch for failing to comply with a verified legal directive?" Sterling swallowed hard. The threat of a banking commission investigation was the magic phrase. He gestured nervously toward his office. "Please come this way, Mr. Vance. Let us sit down and review the account status together." I followed him into his large office. The room smelled like expensive leather and lemon polish. A massive mahogany desk dominated the space with large monitor screens angled away from the guest chairs. I sat down on the edge of a leather armchair. My muscles were tense. I was ready for a fight. Sterling sat behind his desk and quickly typed his password into his computer. He scanned the document one more time before placing it carefully on his blotter. "I will have our legal department verify the notary seal this afternoon," Sterling said, keeping his eyes on his computer screen. "But provisionally, this does appear to grant you immediate authority. What exactly is it that you wish to do today, Mr. Vance?" "I want a full statement of her checking and savings accounts," I demanded. "I want to know exactly how much money she has left." My mother worked 2 jobs for 40 years. She saved every spare penny she ever earned. She had exactly $80,000 in a high-yield savings account when Greg took over her finances 2 years ago. I want those funds frozen right now, so Greg cannot touch another dime. Sterling stopped typing. The rhythmic clicking of his keyboard ceased entirely. The silence in the office became instantly suffocating. He stared at his computer screen for a very long time, his face drained of color. He reached up and adjusted his glasses, his hand trembling slightly. Mr. Vance Sterling began. His voice was barely a whisper. "There seems to be a misunderstanding regarding the current balance of the accounts." "What kind of misunderstanding?" I asked. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. A cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. Sterling turned the large monitor around so it faced me. The bright white screen displayed the official banking records for Helen Vance. There were 2 accounts listed. One was a standard checking account. The other was the primary high-yield savings account. I leaned forward and stared at the numbers. The checking account balance was 0. The high-yield savings account balance was 0. I stopped breathing. The air in the room felt entirely gone. I stared at the digital zeros on the screen until they burned into my retinas. 0. Nothing. The money was completely gone. "Where is it?" I asked. My voice sounded detached, like it belonged to someone else, standing on the other side of the room. "Where is the $80,000? Sterling cleared his throat nervously. He scrolled down the screen, bringing up a list of transaction histories. As the primary proxy over the last 24 months, Greg Vance authorized a series of sweeping transfers. He cited estate management and care facility fees. "Show me the transfers," I demanded, slamming my hand down on the mahogany desk. The loud crack made Sterling jump in his expensive leather chair. "Show me exactly where my mother's money went." Sterling clicked rapidly on his mouse. The screen populated with a long list of outgoing wire transfers. None of the money went to a care facility. None of it went to medical bills. Every single transfer was routed out of my mother's savings account and directly into a private commercial account owned entirely by Greg. The transaction notes were deeply cynical. They read administrative fee or wealth management retainer or simply legal reimbursement. Greg had charged our mother $80,000 to dump her in a state-run Medicaid facility that cost him absolutely nothing. A blinding white-hot rage exploded behind my eyes. I felt physically sick. That money was not just currency. It was the physical manifestation of my mother's entire life of suffering. I remembered the nights she came home from scrubbing office floors, her hands cracked and bleeding from the harsh industrial soaps. I remembered her wrapping her swollen knees in ice packs before standing up in the dark to go serve food at the hospital cafeteria. I remembered her eating leftover scraps from our dinner plates because she refused to spend money on her own groceries. She bled for that money. She sacrificed her youth, her health, and her dreams to build that small safety net. She had saved it dollar by painful dollar, so she would never be a burden to anyone in her final years. And Greg stole it. He did not just take it, he drained it with a cold, calculated, systematic precision. He bled her accounts dry under the legal protection of a shady power of attorney. He used the bank to launder his own mother's life savings right into his pocket to fund his custom saltwater pool and his designer suits. "Freeze the accounts," I said. My voice was completely deadly. It was so low and harsh that Sterling leaned back away from me. "Freeze them right now. And I want the forms to initiate a fraud investigation. I want every single one of those transfers reversed and flagged as financial elder abuse." "Mr. Vance, I understand you are upset," Sterling said, raising his hands defensively, "but you must understand my position. When Greg executed those transfers, he was the legally recognized guardian. The bank processed those requests in good faith, based on the documents he provided at the time. I cannot simply reverse wire transfers that were legally authorized months ago." "He authorized them to steal from a vulnerable elderly woman," I shot back. "Are you telling me a wealth management executive at a major bank watched a son drain $80,000 from an old woman's account into his own private business fund and did not think to flag it as suspicious?" Sterling looked incredibly uncomfortable. His corporate loyalty was clearly warring with his fear of legal exposure. "We are not private investigators, Mr. Vance. We facilitate transactions based on legal authority. Greg had that authority. He is also a very prominent client at this branch. He maintains large commercial accounts here for his car dealership." That was the truth of it. That was why Sterling was sweating. Greg was a big fish. Greg brought millions of dollars flowing through this branch from his massive dealership. The bank manager did not care about a poor old woman losing her life savings. He only cared about keeping a wealthy client happy. "You are going to freeze these accounts based on the new document in front of you," I said, leaning slowly across the desk. "You are going to recognize my authority, or I am going to walk out of this lobby, go straight to the local news stations, and tell them exactly how First National Bank helps wealthy businessmen launder money stolen from dementia patients." Sterling swallowed hard again. He reached for his keyboard. "I will place an immediate administrative freeze on the accounts pending legal review of your document," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "No funds can move in or out. But as you can see, there are no funds left to freeze. The money is already gone." "Do it," I commanded. Sterling typed rapidly, hitting several keys to lock the profile. He printed out a confirmation sheet and slid it across the desk toward me. As he did this, his eyes darted toward the sleek black telephone sitting on the corner of his desk. He looked at the phone and then back at me. If you will excuse me for just one moment, Mr. Vance Sterling said, standing up quickly. I need to take this document to the legal compliance officer down the hall to get the freeze officially coded into the mainframe. I will be right back. He grabbed the notarized paper and practically ran out of the office, shutting the heavy glass door behind him. I sat alone in the quiet room. My blood was boiling. The confirmation sheet in front of me proved my mother was completely bankrupt. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, trying to force my heart rate to slow down. Then I noticed the small light blinking on the base of Sterling's desk phone. It was the indicator light for line 2. Sterling had not gone down the hall to the legal department. He had stepped into an empty adjacent office to make a private phone call. I leaned over the desk and looked closely at the digital display on the phone base. The screen showed the active call log. It was dialing a number I recognized instantly. It was Greg's personal cell phone. The bank manager was alerting him. Sterling was warning his most profitable client that the brother he had mocked yesterday was currently sitting in the bank with a nuclear legal weapon. The chain reaction had officially started. I sat back in the chair. The element of surprise was gone. Greg now knew I had a new power of attorney. He knew I was digging into the finances. He knew I had discovered the stolen $80,000. A man like Greg did not just sit back and wait to be attacked. A man like Greg went on the offensive. He had the money, he had the lawyers, and he had the total lack of morality required to destroy anyone who threatened his lifestyle. Sterling walked back into the office 2 minutes later. He looked flushed and slightly out of breath. He handed my document back to me with a forced, tight smile. The accounts are officially frozen, Mr. Vance Sterling said, refusing to meet my eyes. Our legal team will review the document and contact you if they need anything further. But there is nothing more I can do for you today regarding the missing funds. You will have to take that up with your brother through civil litigation. I folded the thick paper and placed it safely back into my jacket pocket. I stood up and looked down at the bank manager. I knew exactly what he had just done. I did not yell. I did not accuse him of making the phone call. There was no point. The battle lines were already drawn. You backed the wrong brother, Sterling, I said quietly. I turned around and walked out of the office. I marched through the frozen air conditioning of the wealthy banking lobby and pushed my way through the heavy glass doors into the morning sun. The heat of the city hit my face. My mother's life savings were gone. Greg had stolen every single piece of her dignity and her security. And now, because of that phone call, Greg was preparing to strike back. I walked down the concrete steps toward my car, my mind racing with absolute focus. The war had just escalated. I had no money. I had no expensive lawyers, but I had the truth and I had nothing left to lose. I got into my old sedan and gripped the steering wheel, knowing the next few hours were going to test everything I had inside me. I gripped the steering wheel of my old sedan until my knuckles turned white. The drive from First National Bank to the industrial shipping yard usually took 20 minutes, but today, every second felt like a lifetime. The morning sun was beating down on the windshield, baking the interior of my car because the air conditioning had died 3 summers ago. My mind was spinning with the digital zeros I had just seen on the bank manager computer screen. Every penny my mother had saved over 40 years of scrubbing floors had been stolen by my own flesh and blood. Greg had drained her life savings under the guise of estate management. I needed the brutal routine of my logistics job to ground my racing thoughts. I needed the chaotic noise of the shipping warehouse to drown out the rage boiling in my chest. I pulled into the parking lot of Apex Freight 10 minutes before my shift began. The industrial yard was buzzing with aggressive activity. Giant diesel truck engines idled loudly, while forklift drivers shouted instructions over the piercing beep of backup alarms. The air smelled of diesel exhaust, hot asphalt, and hard labor. This was my world. It was loud and dirty and unforgiving, but it was honest work. I earned every dollar I brought home by organizing complex freight schedules and ensuring drivers hit their delivery routes on time. I did not steal. I did not manipulate. I clocked in at the front dispatch desk and grabbed my heavy metal clipboard. Before I could even flip to the first page of the morning delivery, Manifest the dispatch radio, clipped to my belt, cracked to life with a burst of static. It was the senior yard supervisor. His voice sounded unusually tense over the radio frequency. He told me the general manager wanted to see me up in his private office immediately. I felt a sudden strange shift in the atmosphere. A cold, heavy feeling dropped into the pit of my stomach. The general manager of the shipping company was a man named Richard Vance. He was not related to my family in any way, but he and my brother Greg ran in the exact same wealthy elite circles. They played golf at the same exclusive country club on Sunday mornings. They attended the same lavish charity dinners, where men wearing custom-tailored suits drank expensive scotch and pretended to care about the working class. I walked up the metal stairs to the management office, ignoring the rising panic in my gut. I knocked firmly once and pushed the heavy wooden door open. Richard was sitting behind his metal desk. He did not look up from his computer screens when I walked into the room. He did not offer me a seat in the leather guest chairs. He just let me stand there in my worn work boots and faded gray uniform shirt. "Travis," he said, finally leaning back in his expensive ergonomic mesh chair and steepling his fingers together. "We have a serious problem today." I stood near the closed door, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my expression carefully neutral. "What kind of problem, Richard?" I asked, maintaining a professional tone. "Are the northbound freight trucks delayed at the way station again? I can personally reroute them through the Eastern Valley Highway if we need to make up lost transit time for our premium clients." Richard shook his head slowly. He folded his hands on the desk and gave me a look of rehearsed corporate sympathy that made my skin crawl. "It is not the freight trucks, Travis. It is you." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline of a terrible joke. "We are doing some major restructuring across the entire mid-level management team this quarter." Richard continued, his voice smooth and practiced. "We are streamlining our internal operations to maximize profitability and efficiency for the board of directors. Your position is being eliminated effective immediately." The words hit me like a physical blow, directly to the chest. Eliminated. I had worked tirelessly at Apex Freight for 6 grueling years. I had pulled exhausting double shifts during every major holiday season so the other managers could spend time with their families. I had personally covered dispatch duties for drivers who called in sick at 3 in the morning. I had built the entire digital routing matrix they currently used to track cross-country shipments. "I am the senior logistics manager," I said, my voice tight. "You cannot just eliminate my position without the yard falling into chaos." Richard sighed heavily, acting as if my logical defense was just an annoying inconvenience to his busy schedule. "We have transitioned your duties to the automated tracking software you helped implement last year. Frankly, Travis, you have been distracted lately. I hear through the grapevine that you are dealing with some very heavy family issues right now. Taking care of an elderly, sick mother can really take a massive toll on a man's focus and productivity." My blood ran completely cold. The temperature in the office seemed to drop 20 degrees in an instant. He knew about my mother. Greg had called him. My brother had made a phone call to his wealthy country club buddy to cut off my only source of survival. "This has absolutely nothing to do with corporate restructuring," I said, stepping closer to his desk and planting my feet firmly on the carpet. "Greg called you this morning, did he not? My brother asked you for a massive personal favor to get me fired, so I would not have the financial resources to hire a lawyer and fight him in probate court." Richard narrowed his eyes. The fake polite sympathy completely vanished from his face, instantly replaced by cold, wealthy arrogance. "I do not know what conspiracy theories you are talking about. But I do know that Greg is a very highly respected businessman in this local community. He brings millions of dollars in commercial shipping contracts to this yard every year. If a powerful man like Greg tells me his younger brother is becoming mentally unstable and dangerously erratic, I am highly inclined to listen to his warning. We simply cannot have a massive liability managing our expensive freight lines. Pack up your personal locker right now and leave the commercial property before I call yard security to physically escort you out." They had orchestrated a flawless execution. Greg was using his business connections to destroy my life before I could fight back. There was no point in fighting a corporate man who had already chosen the winning side. I walked down the metal stairs to the locker room in a complete daze. I emptied my bright orange safety vest, my spare steel-toed boots, and my dented coffee thermos into a small brown cardboard box. 10 minutes later, I was walking across the gravel parking lot carrying 6 years of my hardest work in a cardboard square. The midday summer sun was incredibly brutal, baking the dark asphalt and making the air visually shimmer with suffocating heat. I placed the box on the torn passenger seat of my old sedan and turned the ignition key. The engine groaned violently before sputtering to life. I pulled out of the shipping yard, my mind racing with unadulterated panic. How was I going to pay my monthly rent? How was I going to hire a competent probate lawyer to fight Greg? How was I going to save my mother from that terrible windowless room when I could not even manage to save myself from total ruin? I merged onto the highway, desperately trying to formulate a survival plan. I was driving in the center lane, surrounded by massive speeding commercial trucks and aggressive daily commuters. Suddenly, a loud metallic crack echoed from beneath the floorboards of my car. It sounded like a heavy steel pipe hitting solid concrete at 60 miles per hour. The entire vehicle violently jerked forward aggressively, throwing my chest hard against the locking seatbelt. The engine RPM needle shot straight into the red zone, but the car immediately started losing momentum. I pressed the gas pedal all the way down to the floor mat. Absolutely nothing happened. The broken engine just screamed in high-pitched agony, but the tires received zero power. The old transmission had completely blown apart right in the middle of the highway. I wrestled the heavy steering wheel as the power steering completely died, forcing the dying vehicle across 2 dangerous lanes of angry honking traffic. I barely managed to coast onto the narrow dirt shoulder before the car rolled to a permanent dead stop. Thick black smoke began to pour out from under the peeling hood, smelling of burnt rubber and scorched metal. I sat in the sweltering driver's seat, listening to the loud, agonizing hiss of the ruined engine block. I rested my sweaty forehead directly against the steering wheel and let out a long, desperate, broken breath. I had absolutely no job. I had $0 in my frozen savings account, and now I had no working transportation to get anywhere. I was forced to abandon the smoking car on the dangerous side of the highway because I could not even afford a basic tow truck. I grabbed my cardboard box and began the brutal 3-mile walk back to my apartment complex. The relentless sun beat down on my shoulders, drenching my gray work shirt in heavy sweat. Every step I took felt like I was walking through deep mud. When I reached my rundown apartment building, my legs were trembling from severe exhaustion. I climbed the 3 flights of concrete stairs, wanting to collapse onto my cheap mattress and sleep. But as I approached my faded wooden door, I saw a bright neon yellow paper securely taped directly over the peephole. It was an official legal notice from the property management company. Final notice of immediate eviction. I had unfortunately fallen behind on my rent payments 2 months ago when I emptied my personal checking account to pay for my mother's specialized neurological medical tests because Greg had flatly refused to authorize the funds from her estate. I had promised the angry landlord I would pay the remaining balance this upcoming Friday when I got my paycheck. But now I had no paycheck coming ever again. I ripped the yellow paper off the door, unlocked the deadbolt, and stepped into my stifling dark apartment. I dropped the cardboard box onto the floor and sank down against the cracked drywall. The small apartment was dead silent. I sat in the dim afternoon light, staring blankly at the cheap laminate flooring. Greg had won the war in a single morning. In less than 24 hours, my brother had ruthlessly deployed his wealth and corporate connections to crush my entire existence. He took my mother's precious vintage wedding ring. He stole her $80,000 life savings. He got me fired from my only source of income. My only car was dead on the side of a busy highway, and I was about to be legally thrown out onto the dangerous city streets. I was pushed to the absolute brink of human endurance. I had 0 financial resources and 0 allies in this fight. I was a complete pathetic failure, just like his wife Chloe had cruelly said in the nursing home parking lot. I pulled my aching knees tightly to my chest and buried my sweaty face in my rough hands. The crushing heavy weight of absolute defeat settled permanently over my tired shoulders. I was genuinely ready to give up the fight. I really, truly was. But then, as I shifted my weight, I felt a sharp, uncomfortable stiffness inside my jacket pocket. The thick, folded legal paper was pressing firmly against my ribs. The power of attorney document my mother had secretly signed on her birthday. It was the only thing of value I had left in the entire world. I pulled the heavy document out and unfolded it on my knees. I stared at the shining gold notary seal and the shaky black ink of her beautiful signature. I gently traced her name with my index finger, vividly remembering the fierce, burning clarity in her brown eyes when she commanded me to take back control of her life. She had explicitly trusted me. She had brilliantly orchestrated this silent, secret rebellion because she knew in her heart I was the only person on earth who would actually fight for her dignity. I wiped the salty sweat from my forehead and forced myself to read the legal document one more time. I had only read the primary clauses the night before, focusing on the healthcare proxy and the main banking accounts. But this time, sitting in the heat of rock bottom, I read the extremely fine print. I read the dense paragraphs deeply buried at the absolute bottom of the third page. My tired eyes rapidly scanned over the standard boring legal jargon until I suddenly reached a highly specific bolded subsection labeled Schedule C Asset Access. I completely stopped breathing. The black words on the white page suddenly sharpened, coming into crystal clear, incredible focus. The document did not just grant me legal control over her empty bank accounts. It explicitly granted me exclusive access to a highly specific private safe deposit box. But the mysterious box was not located at First National Bank, where Greg did all his shady business. The specific box was registered at the Fidelity Trust Depository, a completely different elite bank located on the far north side of the city. My heart instantly started to pound against my ribcage. A slow realization washed over my exhausted body. Why would an elderly woman who worked 2 minimum wage jobs her entire life maintain a highly secure private safe deposit box at an elite depository completely across town? Why would she carefully write the exact box number into a secret power of attorney document prepared months in advance? The stolen $80,000 was nothing but a clever distraction. It was just the obvious money Greg already knew about. But my brilliant mother was always one crucial step ahead of his greed. The heavy paper shaking in my hands was not just a legal defensive shield. It was a literal treasure map. I did not have a job. I did not have a car. I did not have a home. But I had a legal key to something my arrogant brother did not even know existed. I stood up from the floor, the crushing exhaustion vanishing from my muscles. I was going to that bank. The morning air in the city felt heavy and suffocating as I walked away from my broken-down car, abandoned on the side of the busy highway. I had exactly $14.62 in my front pocket. That was my entire net worth in the world. Greg had systematically stripped away everything else. He took my career at the logistics company. He took my transportation. He took my mother's life savings. But as I walked toward the bus stop on the corner of 5th and Elm, I did not feel like a defeated man. I felt a strange burning clarity radiating from the folded legal document pressed securely against my ribs. I paid the $2 bus fare with crumpled bills and sat in the very back row of the transit vehicle. The city bus smelled like stale coffee and wet raincoats. I watched the grimy urban landscape slowly transition into the towering glass skyscrapers of the wealthy financial district. My mother had scrubbed floors in buildings just like those for decades. She spent countless hours on her hands and knees, making sure the marble lobbies were spotless for wealthy corporate executives who never even bothered to learn her first name. She did all of that grueling labor just to survive and provide for her 2 sons. And now, I was riding a public bus to an elite depository using a secret map she had hidden at the absolute bottom of a power of attorney document. The Fidelity Trust Depository was located on the far north side of the city. It was a place designed exclusively for the ultra-wealthy and the highly secretive. It was not a normal commercial bank like the one Greg used. They did not offer checking accounts or mortgage loans to average citizens. They provided highly secure private storage for people who had massive assets they wanted to keep completely hidden from the rest of the world. Why on earth did Helen Vance have a secure box at a place like this? That terrifying question echoed in my mind with every single bump of the long bus ride. I stepped off the bus and walked up to the massive bronze doors of the depository. The building looked like an impenetrable fortress carved out of solid gray granite. There were no bright advertising banners or friendly teller windows visible from the street. There was only a discreet brass plaque next to a tinted glass entry point. I took a deep breath, smoothed the worn lapels of my faded gray suit, and pushed the heavy door open. The interior was completely silent and freezing cold. The floors were covered in thick, dark carpet that absorbed all ambient sound. A single security guard in a tailored black suit watched me carefully as I approached the massive mahogany reception desk. An older woman with silver hair and a silk scarf looked up from her glowing computer screen. She had cold, calculating eyes that immediately assessed my worn-out work boots and cheap suit jacket. "Good morning, sir," she said in a tone that clearly implied I was lost and did not belong in her building. "How may we direct you today?" "I'm here to access a private safe deposit box," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly flat and steady. "I need to visit box number 704. The receptionist raised a perfectly manicured eyebrow, looking at me with deep skepticism. "Access to our private vaults requires a verified account and strict biometric identification, sir," she explained condescendingly. "I do not have a biometric profile here," I said, reaching slowly into my inside jacket pocket, "but I have a fully executed and notarized power of attorney granting me absolute administrative control over all the assets of Helen Vance." I placed the thick folded document directly on her pristine mahogany desk. She looked at the paper as if it were a piece of garbage before reluctantly picking it up. I watched her read the fine print. I watched her eyes widen slightly when she saw the flawless gold notary seal and the highly specific legal clauses my mother had meticulously prepared months ago. "One moment, please," she said, standing up quickly and walking through a reinforced steel door behind the desk. I stood in the silent lobby for 15 agonizing minutes, waiting for a verdict. My stomach tied itself into tight, painful knots while I waited. If Greg had somehow anticipated this desperate move and blocked my access, I was completely out of options. I would be permanently thrown out onto the street, and my mother would die in that terrible windowless room, smelling of bleach. Finally, the steel door hissed open, and the receptionist returned, followed by a tall man in a sharp gray suit holding a heavy ring of brass keys. "Mr. Vance," the man said with a polite but highly cautious nod. "My name is Director Harrison. We have verified the legal authenticity of your document with our internal legal counsel. Your administrative authority over Box 704 is currently active and fully recognized by this institution. Please follow me to the vault." My heart hammered violently against my ribs as I followed Director Harrison down a long, brightly lit corridor. We passed through two separate heavy steel vault doors that required retinal scans and complex numeric passcodes. The security in this facility was absolutely staggering. We finally stepped into a massive underground room lined from floor to ceiling with thousands of sleek, polished steel compartments. It looked like a futuristic library holding the darkest financial secrets of the city elite. Harrison walked down the fourth aisle and stopped in front of a medium-sized metal door located at waist height. He inserted his master key into the left lock and turned it with a heavy mechanical click. He then stepped back and gestured toward the secure box. "The space is yours, Mr. Vance," he said softly, stepping away from the compartment. "I will wait outside the main vault door until you are completely finished. Take as much time as you require." He turned and walked away, leaving me completely alone in the silent, freezing steel room. I stared at the metal door of Box 704. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to force myself to take a deep, steadying breath before reaching out. I honestly expected to find the missing $80,000. I assumed my brilliant mother had somehow managed to secretly withdraw her entire life savings before Greg could steal it. I thought she had simply hidden the physical cash inside this secure vault to protect it from his greed. I reached out and pulled the metal door open. I slid the heavy black metal container out of the steel wall and placed it carefully on the small viewing table provided in the center of the aisle. I unlatched the top cover and flipped the lid open. There was no cash. There were no stacks of $100 bills bound in rubber bands. There was absolutely no money at all inside the container. Instead, the dark box was filled to the brim with thick stacks of heavy manila folders and densely printed corporate documents. I stared at the paper in total confusion. A heavy, crushing wave of bitter disappointment washed over my exhausted body. I desperately needed cash right now. I needed money to hire a ruthless probate lawyer to fight my powerful brother in court. I needed money to pay my overdue rent so I would not be thrown out onto the dangerous city streets by the end of the week. I needed money to rescue my mother from the Medicaid facility. Paper documents were not going to pay the terrifying bills that were piling up on my kitchen table. I reached into the box and pulled out the very first manila folder. I opened it and began reading the complex legal text under the harsh fluorescent lights of the vault. As my tired eyes scanned the paragraphs, my initial disappointment rapidly transformed into absolute, complete shock. The primary document was an official certificate of incorporation from the state government. Helen Vance had secretly formed a private limited liability company exactly 15 years ago, just a few months after our father passed away. The holding company was named HV Properties, LLC. My mother, the woman who worked 2 minimum wage jobs and wrapped her swollen knees in ice packs every single night, was the sole managing director and absolute owner of a private corporate entity. I grabbed the next stack of documents from the dark metal box. My hands were moving frantically now, flipping through the pages as fast as I could read them. I pulled out thick stacks of property deeds, official county tax records, and complex commercial zoning permits. The documents were an incredibly complex labyrinth of real estate transactions that I barely understood at first glance. I sat down on the small metal stool next to the viewing table and began slowly decoding the extensive paperwork. For over 2 hours, I sat in the freezing vault, piecing together a massive financial puzzle my mother had masterfully constructed completely in the shadows. When my father died, he left behind a small, modest life insurance policy. We all assumed my mother used that money to pay for our basic living expenses and keep food on the table, but the corporate ledgers in my hands proved otherwise. She had taken that small insurance payout and quietly purchased a barren piece of commercial land on the edge of the city development zone. She bought the empty dirt for pennies on the dollar because the area was considered completely undesirable and commercially dead at the time. She held on to that land, patiently paying the tiny property taxes every single year from her meager waitressing tips. She never told my father. She never told Greg. She never told me. She simply waited for the city to grow. 10 years later, the city rapidly expanded outward. The local government built a massive highway intersection directly adjacent to her empty dirt lot, transforming the traffic flow of the entire region. Overnight, that useless, barren property became prime commercial real estate, highly sought after by corporate developers. But she did not sell it for a quick profit. She formed HV Properties, LLC, and leased the land to a massive commercial enterprise. The puzzle pieces began snapping together in my mind with terrifying clarity. I flipped through the heavy stack of commercial lease agreements, reading the specific tenant names and financial terms. The land my mother owned through her secret corporation was exactly 3 acres in size. It was located in the most expensive commercial retail district in the entire state. I stared at the specific property address printed clearly at the top of the official county deeds. My blood ran completely cold in my veins. The address belonged to the exact same massive multi-million-dollar car dealership that my brother Greg currently operated. The absolute magnitude of the secret hit me like a runaway freight train. Greg did not own his empire. Greg did not own the valuable ground he walked on every single day. His entire wealthy lifestyle, his custom-tailored suits, his luxury sports car, and his million-dollar mansion were all built on land secretly owned by the mother he had just dumped in a miserable state-run nursing home. He was nothing but a commercial tenant, leasing dirt from an old woman he thought was entirely helpless. My brilliant mother had orchestrated the greatest financial long game I had ever seen. She had completely outsmarted a man who considered himself a corporate genius. I frantically stuffed the thick stacks of corporate deeds and LLC ledgers into my battered leather briefcase. I closed the empty metal box, slid it back into the steel wall, and locked the compartment securely. I walked out of the vault, my mind racing with a million aggressive strategies. I now possessed the legal authority to control the LLC. I had the power to audit my brother. I had the power to destroy his entire false empire. I thanked Director Harrison and practically ran out of the depository. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the city sidewalks. I needed to get back to my apartment immediately to review the commercial lease terms and find out exactly how much rent Greg owed the corporation. I caught the evening bus and rode back to the south side of town. I jogged the 3 blocks from the bus stop to my apartment complex, gripping my heavy briefcase like it was a shield. I climbed the 3 flights of concrete stairs, my boots pounding against the steps. I was ready for war. I was ready to tear Greg apart piece by piece for what he had done to our family. But as I reached the small landing outside my front door, a tall man in a dark trench coat stepped out of the shadows, blocking my path completely. He had been waiting for me. "Are you Travis Vance?" The man asked, his voice completely devoid of any emotion. "Yes, I am," I replied, stopping dead in my tracks and tightening my grip on the briefcase. The man reached into his coat and pulled out a thick envelope sealed with red tape. He shoved it directly into my chest, forcing me to take it. I was served with court papers. "You have been officially served," the man said, turning around and quickly walking down the stairs without looking back. I stood frozen in the dim hallway, clutching the heavy envelope. I ripped the red tape off and pulled out the legal documents. They were an emergency injunction filed in the county probate court. Greg had just initiated a massive legal escalation. He had filed a lawsuit claiming I was mentally unstable and demanding the court declare our mother legally incompetent. He wanted a judge to grant him absolute permanent guardianship, which would instantly revoke my power of attorney and render the LLC documents in my briefcase completely useless. The court date was stamped at the top of the page. The hearing was scheduled for exactly 48 hours from now. If I lost that hearing, Greg would win everything forever. My mother would be trapped in that facility until she died, and I would be left with absolutely nothing. The battle lines were officially drawn, and the clock was ticking down to my absolute destruction. The heavy footsteps of the man in the dark trench coat echoed down the concrete stairwell, fading into the quiet evening noise of the city. I stood completely frozen on the narrow landing outside my apartment door, holding the thick envelope sealed with aggressive red tape. The air in the hallway suddenly felt impossibly thin. I stared down at the bold black letters printed across the top of the crisp white pages. County Probate Court Emergency Injunction and Petition for Absolute Guardianship. The words blurred together for a second. As a wave of pure nausea rolled through my empty stomach, I unlocked my front door with trembling fingers and pushed my way into the dark, suffocating heat of my small living room. I dropped my heavy leather briefcase onto the floor and sat down at the cheap laminate kitchen table. I did not bother turning on the overhead light. The pale orange glow from the street lamp outside my window provided just enough illumination to read the legal documents that were designed to destroy my life. Greg had not just counterattacked. He had launched a massive, calculated legal strike. I spread the court papers across the table and forced myself to read every single line of the dense legal jargon. My brother had hired a ruthless corporate law firm to draft a petition claiming that our mother, Helen Vance, was suffering from severe, irreversible dementia. The document explicitly stated she lacked the basic mental capacity to understand her own actions, sign legal documents, or make decisions regarding her physical care and financial estate. Greg was asking the probate judge to declare her legally incompetent and to grant him absolute permanent guardianship. The strategy was brutally simple and completely devastating. If the judge agreed with Greg and declared our mother incompetent, the power of attorney document she had secretly signed on her birthday would be instantly rendered void. The law dictated that a person could not execute a legal proxy if they were not of sound mind. Greg was using her temporary moments of confusion to permanently erase her moments of sharp clarity. He wanted the court to legally erase her voice forever. And the most terrifying part was the timeline stamped in bright red ink at the top of the summons. The emergency hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning at 9 o'clock. I looked at the digital clock on my microwave. It was currently flashing 8:15 on Tuesday night. I had exactly 48 hours until the judge slammed the gavel down on my mother's entire existence. The absolute stakes of this hearing crushed down on my shoulders like a physical weight. If I walked into that courtroom and lost my brother, would win everything. Helen would be permanently trapped in that grim, windowless Medicaid facility for the rest of her natural life. She would spend her final years staring at a peeling green wall, smelling industrial bleach, and wondering why her youngest son never came to save her. Greg would get away with stealing her $80,000 life savings, using the stolen funds to pay the very lawyers who were currently orchestrating her permanent confinement. And I would be left completely bankrupt, jobless, and homeless, cast out onto the street, while Greg lounged by his custom saltwater pool. I pushed the court papers away and pulled the heavy leather briefcase onto my lap. I took out the thick stacks of corporate documents I had recovered from the private safe deposit box at the Fidelity Trust Depository, the Certificate of Incorporation for HV Properties, LLC, the original property deeds, the massive commercial lease agreement. These papers were the only weapon I had left in the entire world. But a weapon is entirely useless if you do not know how to fire it. I had 48 hours to figure out exactly what these LLC documents meant and how they could stop an emergency guardianship injunction. I spent the entire night sitting at that small kitchen table, reading until my eyes burned and my vision blurred. I cross-referenced the state property codes using an old laptop that took 10 minutes to load a single web page. The puzzle my mother had constructed was brilliant, but it was incredibly complex. She had purchased the 3 acres of barren commercial land decades ago and held it patiently. When the city expanded and the highway intersection was built, the land became prime real estate. Greg, wanting to build his massive luxury car dealership, needed that exact location because of its perfect visibility from the interstate. I read through the commercial lease agreement my mother had drafted 15 years ago. The terms were strictly professional. HV Properties, LLC agreed to lease the 3 acres to Vance Automotive Group for a period of 30 years. The monthly rent was substantial, reflecting the true market value of the prime commercial dirt. For the first 10 years, Greg actually paid the rent. I found the corresponding bank deposit slips in a separate manila folder. He paid the LLC every single month, and my mother quietly deposited those funds into her private accounts, building her secret financial safety net while still living her modest, quiet life. But then, I found the shift. I flipped to the ledgers covering the last 5 years. The deposits slowly became erratic. Greg started paying late. Then he started paying half the required amount. And then, exactly 3 years ago, the payments stopped entirely. There was not a single deposit recorded in the LLC ledgers for 36 consecutive months. I leaned back in my chair, the cheap plastic creaking loudly in the silent apartment. I closed my eyes and pictured Greg leaning against his brand new midnight black Porsche in the nursing home parking lot. I remembered the arrogant sneer on his face when he mocked my modest income and called me a pathetic loser. Greg had stopped paying his commercial rent because he assumed our mother was getting old and forgetful. He assumed she would never notice the missing funds, or that she simply did not understand the complex corporate structure she had created. He took advantage of her declining health to quietly default on a massive commercial lease, saving himself millions of dollars in operating expenses. He used that stolen rent money to fund his extravagant lifestyle, to buy his $1 million mansion, and to drape his terrible wife in designer clothes. Greg built his entire empire on stolen ground. He was a commercial tenant who was currently 3 years in default. I looked back down at the lease agreement, my hands shaking with a new adrenaline-fueled energy. I turned to the section labeled Landlord Remedies for Tenant Default. The legal language was absolute and unforgiving. If the tenant failed to pay rent for a period exceeding 90 days, the landlord possessed the immediate right to terminate the lease demand, all back owed rent, and initiate immediate eviction proceedings to reclaim the commercial property. Any structures built on the land, including the massive glass showrooms of the dealership, would become the property of the landlord upon termination of the lease. My mother had total power to evict him. And because she had signed that notarized document on her birthday, I was now the sole managing director of HV Properties LLC. I held the exact same power, but there was a massive legal trap waiting for me in the probate court. If I walked into the hearing on Thursday morning and simply showed the judge these LLC documents, Greg's high-priced lawyers would completely destroy me. They would argue that the power of attorney granting me control of the LLC was invalid because my mother was legally incompetent when she signed it. The judge, looking at my frayed suit and my lack of legal representation, would likely agree. The court would grant Greg permanent guardianship. He would immediately use that guardianship to dissolve the LLC, forgive his own massive commercial debt, and sell the land directly to himself for pennies. I could not just defend my mother. Defending her mental state was a losing battle against a man with unlimited financial resources and a willingness to commit perjury. I had to go on the offensive. I had to strike a blow so massive and so undeniable that it would shatter Greg's entire facade of wealth and respectability, right in front of the judge. When the sun finally rose on Wednesday morning, painting the sky outside my window a pale, bruised purple, I had a plan. It was a desperate, reckless plan, but it was the only option I had left. I packed the LLC documents, the commercial lease, and the default ledgers back into my briefcase. I drank a glass of cold tap water, put on my faded gray suit, and walked out the door. I had exactly 24 hours left until the hearing. I rode the early morning city bus downtown to the county courthouse complex. I did not go to the probate clerk, where Greg had filed his injunction. I walked 2 blocks over to the public legal aid clinic. The clinic was located in a cramped basement office, smelling of stale coffee and old paper. The waiting room was filled with exhausted people, desperate for free legal help to stop evictions, fight predatory loans, and navigate a justice system that only catered to the wealthy. I took a numbered ticket and sat in a hard plastic chair for 4 agonizing hours, watching the clock on the wall tick away my precious remaining time. Finally, a tired-looking paralegal with kind eyes called my number. I sat down across from her cluttered metal desk and opened my briefcase. I did not tell her about the guardianship battle. I did not tell her about the stolen $80,000 or the windowless nursing home room. I kept my request strictly focused on commercial real estate law. I am the newly appointed managing director of a private limited liability company, I told her, keeping my voice calm and professional. I have a commercial tenant who is currently 3 years in default on a substantial land lease. I need the proper forms to draft a formal commercial lease default and an immediate notice of eviction. The paralegal looked at my cheap suit and then looked down at the pristine corporate documents I slid across her desk. She raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the magnitude of the commercial property described in the lease. She reviewed the power of attorney document checking, the notary seal, and the specific clauses granting me administrative control. She nodded slowly. "Your paperwork is completely bulletproof," she said, handing the documents back to me. Under state commercial property law, you do not need a judge to sign off on an initial default notice if the terms are explicitly outlined in the original lease. You simply need to draft the notice of default, cite the specific breach of contract, and formally serve it to the tenant. If they cannot produce the missing rent within the cure period, you have the legal right to seize the property. She printed out a stack of blank commercial default templates and handed me a black pen. I sat at a small wooden table in the corner of the basement clinic for another 3 hours, carefully filling out every single line. I listed HV Properties LLC as the landlord. I listed Vance Automotive Group as the defaulting tenant. I calculated the back owed rent based on the ledgers, adding the compounding interest penalties explicitly allowed by the lease agreement. The final number was absolutely staggering. Greg owed the LLC over $2 million in unpaid rent and penalties. I signed the bottom of the default notice as the managing director. The ink dried on the page, solidifying the financial weapon I was going to use to destroy my brother. I left the legal clinic late Wednesday afternoon. The heat of the day was breaking, giving way to a cool evening breeze. I had the commercial eviction notice completely finalized, but I knew serving it to Greg at his dealership would be a fatal mistake. If I handed it to him today, he would immediately call his lawyers. They would file an emergency stay, they would tie the eviction up in corporate litigation, and they would use it as further proof in probate court tomorrow that I was a hostile, unstable actor harassing my successful brother. I could not give him time to react. I could not let his expensive lawyers prepare a defense. I had to deliver the eviction notice in a place where he could not hide behind his corporate shields. I had to deliver it on the official public record, where a judge could see exactly who the real fraud was. I returned to my dark apartment on Wednesday night. My stomach growled violently, reminding me I had not eaten a real meal in 2 days. I ignored the hunger. I laid my gray suit out on the small sofa, brushing off the invisible dust and making sure the lapels were completely flat. I packed my briefcase with meticulous precision. I placed the emergency guardianship injunction on the left side. I placed the LLC incorporation papers, the original property deeds, and the signed commercial eviction notice on the right side. I sat on the edge of my cheap mattress in the dark, listening to the distant wail of a police siren. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, I would walk into probate court. Greg would be there wearing his custom-tailored navy suit. Chloe would likely be there, wearing her oversized designer sunglasses and carrying her expensive leather handbag. They would look at me with absolute contempt. They would present themselves as the wealthy, responsible saviors of a tragic, elderly woman. They would lie under oath. They would tell the judge I was a pathetic failure who could not be trusted to manage a single dollar. They thought they were walking into a simple guardianship hearing to finalize their control over Helen Vance. They thought they were going to put the final nail in my coffin and walk away with absolute victory. They had absolutely no idea that I was not walking into that courtroom to defend myself. I was walking into that courtroom to execute a total financial demolition. The 48 hours were almost up. The trap was fully set, and tomorrow morning, when the gavel finally fell, my brother was going to lose his entire world. The glowing red numbers on my microwave clock read exactly 11:15 at night. The suffocating heat of my small apartment wrapped around my exhausted body like a heavy woolen blanket. I sat alone at my cheap laminate kitchen table with the single overhead light bulb casting harsh shadows across the room. On the left side of the table lay the emergency court injunction Greg had just served me. That stack of white paper represented my absolute destruction. It was a ticking time bomb, with exactly 48 hours remaining before a probate judge would permanently lock my mother in a windowless room and strip me of everything. On the right side of the table sat my battered leather briefcase. Inside that briefcase was the stack of corporate documents I had pulled from the freezing steel vault of the Fidelity Trust Depository. I had spent my last few dollars on a bus ride to get those papers. I had sacrificed my pride, my job, and my only car for a chance to fight back. But sitting in the heavy silence of my apartment, I felt an overwhelming wave of doubt wash over my tired shoulders. I was just a mid-level logistics manager. I spent my days routing freight trucks and managing warehouse inventories. I did not have a law degree. I did not understand complex corporate structures or high-level commercial real estate transactions. Greg had an army of expensive corporate lawyers on his payroll. I had a cheap ballpoint pen and a pot of stale black coffee. I rubbed my burning eyes and opened the leather briefcase. I pulled out the thick manila folders and spread the contents across the table, completely covering the surface. I decided to treat the complex legal paperwork exactly like a massive missing freight manifest. In logistics, everything has an origin point and a destination. You just have to follow the paper trail and find where the route connects. I started with the oldest document in the stack. It was a faded certificate of incorporation from the state government, stamped with a date from exactly 15 years ago. It officially established a private holding company named HV Properties, LLC. Helen Vance was listed as the sole managing director and the absolute owner of the corporate entity. I stared at her signature on the bottom of the page. It was smooth and bold, written long before the terrible fog of dementia began to cloud her mind. I thought about the woman who had scrubbed office floors before dawn and served hospital cafeteria food until dark. She had worn cheap shoes with holes in the soles just so Greg and I could have new winter coats. I had always believed she was just surviving day by day, but this document proved she was secretly building an invisible fortress right under our noses. I moved to the next stack of papers. They were official county property deeds and complex tax records. I read through the dense paragraphs trying to decode the legal jargon. I traced the dates and the financial numbers. Shortly after our father died suddenly of a heart attack, he left behind a very modest life insurance policy. We all assumed my mother used that small payout to pay for our basic groceries and keep the electricity running. We thought she spent it all on our survival. But the corporate ledgers revealed a completely different story. She had taken every single penny of that insurance money and quietly purchased 3 acres of barren, undeveloped dirt on the far eastern edge of the city. At the time she bought it, the land was considered completely worthless. It was miles away from the commercial district, sitting near an abandoned industrial park. But my mother did not buy it for what it was. She bought it for what she knew it would become. She paid the tiny annual property taxes out of her meager waitressing tips, never telling anyone about her secret investment. She patiently held on to that empty dirt for a decade. Then the city government announced a massive infrastructure expansion. They built a brand new multi-lane highway intersection directly adjacent to her property to connect the growing suburbs to the downtown financial district. Overnight, the traffic flow of the entire region changed entirely. That useless 3-acre lot was suddenly transformed into the most highly visible and incredibly valuable commercial real estate in the entire state. Corporate developers flooded the area building shopping malls and luxury retail centers. The value of her land skyrocketed into the millions, but she never sold it. She incorporated HV Properties LLC and decided to lease the commercial ground to a massive corporate tenant. I reached for the thickest document on the table. It was the Master Commercial Lease Agreement. The paper was heavy and the print was tiny. My heart began to beat faster against my ribs as I flipped past the standard legal clauses and went straight to the property description and the tenant identification section. I needed to know exactly who was renting this golden piece of real estate from my mother. I dragged my index finger down the page until I found the registered address of the 3-acre lot. I read the street name and the block number. My breath completely caught in my throat. The air in my apartment suddenly felt freezing cold. I read the address a second time and then a third time just to make sure my exhausted mind was not playing cruel tricks on me. I knew that exact address perfectly. It was a location I drove past every single morning on my way to the shipping warehouse. The 3 acres of prime commercial real estate owned by HV Properties LLC was the exact location of Vance Automotive Group. It was Greg's massive multi-million-dollar luxury car dealership. I pushed my chair back from the table, my hands shaking violently. I stood up and paced across the small room, my mind exploding with the sheer magnitude of the revelation. Travis finally connects the dots in the LLC paperwork. The holding company Helen owns possesses the 3 acres of prime commercial real estate that Greg's massive multi-million-dollar car dealership is built on. I pictured the sprawling dealership in my head. It was a monument to modern wealth. It featured a towering 3-story glass showroom filled with imported European sports cars. It had a massive, pristine service center with dozens of hydraulic lifts. It had perfectly manicured landscaping and a soaring steel sign that illuminated the night sky. Greg walked around that property every single day, wearing his custom-tailored navy suits, acting like an absolute king. He gave interviews to local business magazines, bragging about his incredible self-made empire. He looked down on the entire city from his corner office, believing he was an untouchable titan of industry. But his entire wealth was a complete facade. Greg did not own the valuable ground he walked on. He did not own the dirt beneath his expensive imported cars. He was nothing but a commercial tenant. He was a renter. He leased the very foundation of his empire from the mother he had just dumped in a miserable, windowless Medicaid facility. My brilliant, quiet mother owned the kingdom, and she had let him build his shiny glass castle right on top of her land. I rushed back to the table and frantically tore open the final manila folder. It contained the monthly financial ledgers and the bank deposit records for the LLC. I needed to see the money trail. I needed to know exactly how this arrangement worked between them. I spread the ledger sheets out under the harsh light bulb. For the first 10 years of the lease agreement, Greg actually paid his rent. I traced his monthly payments recorded meticulously in my mother's neat handwriting. He paid a massive commercial premium for the location, and those funds were deposited directly into the secret Fidelity Trust depository accounts. My mother had generated massive hidden wealth from his business while still living in her modest house and wearing her old blue robe. But then, I flipped to the ledgers covering the last 5 years. The ink changed. The neat columns of numbers began to look erratic. I traced the dates slowly. Greg's payments started arriving late. Then they were only half the required contractual amount. And then, exactly 5 years ago, the payment stopped entirely. There was a sudden glaring blank space on the accounting sheets that stretched month after month, year after year. Greg, assuming Mom was clueless and helpless, stopped paying rent to the LLC 5 years ago to fund his lavish lifestyle with Chloe. The absolute depravity of his betrayal hit me like a physical punch to the stomach. 5 years ago was exactly when my mother first started showing the early signs of memory loss. It was when the terrible fog first started rolling into her mind. Greg noticed she was becoming forgetful. He noticed she was losing track of conversations and misplacing her keys. Instead of getting her the best neurological medical care available, he saw a massive financial opportunity. He realized that the only person who knew about the commercial lease and the LLC was an old woman whose mind was slowly slipping away. He assumed she had completely forgotten about her own corporation. He assumed she was entirely helpless and lacked the mental capacity to ever enforce the terms of the legal contract. So he just stopped paying his rent. He defaulted on his multi-million-dollar commercial lease intentionally and maliciously. He took the massive amount of money he owed his own mother and he diverted it directly into his personal bank accounts. He used that stolen rent money to buy his midnight black Porsche Panamera. He used it to buy his sprawling mansion with the vaulted ceilings and the custom saltwater pool. I used it to drape Chloe in oversized designer sunglasses and expensive leather handbags. Every single piece of luxury they rubbed in my face in the nursing home parking lot was paid for with money stolen from an elderly woman suffering from cognitive decline. I gripped the edges of the kitchen table so hard, my knuckles turned completely white. The rage inside my chest was no longer a wild burning fire. It was a cold, sharp, precise weapon. Greg thought he was a genius. He thought he had orchestrated the perfect crime. He drained her $80,000 personal savings account because that was the money he had legal access to as her fraudulent guardian. But he completely ignored the LLC because he thought it was a forgotten ghost. I thought the secret died when her memory faded. He never imagined that she would have moments of sharp, terrifying clarity. He never imagined that she would secretly notarize a power of attorney and hand it to the brother he considered a pathetic loser. I looked down at the default clauses buried deep within the master commercial lease agreement. The legal language drafted 15 years ago was absolute and entirely unforgiving. If the tenant failed to pay the agreed-upon rent for a period exceeding 90 days, the landlord possessed the immediate right to terminate the agreement. The landlord had the authority to demand all back-owed rent with compounding interest and initiate immediate eviction proceedings to reclaim the commercial property. But the most devastating clause was hidden at the very bottom of the page. Any permanent structures built on the land, including showrooms, service centers, and offices, would legally become the absolute property of the landlord upon the termination of the lease due to default. Because of the secret document my mother signed on her birthday, I was now the sole managing director of HV Properties, LLC. I held the exact same power she did. I had the legal authority to terminate the lease. I had the power to evict Vance Automotive Group. I had the power to seize the massive glass showroom and every single structure Greg had built. I looked at the emergency guardianship injunction sitting on the left side of the table. Greg filed that lawsuit to declare her incompetent so he could legally erase her voice forever. He wanted to become her absolute permanent guardian before anyone ever discovered the truth about the LLC. If he won that hearing in 48 hours, he would simply dissolve the corporation, forgive his own massive commercial debt, and formally transfer the prime real estate into his own name for pennies. I would win everything, but he did not know that I had the safe deposit box keys. He did not know that I was sitting in my sweltering apartment, reading his financial death warrant. I grabbed my black ink pen and a blank sheet of paper. I did not have a job anymore. I did not have a car to drive. I had an eviction notice taped to my own front door, but tomorrow morning I was going to draft a commercial eviction notice of my own. I was going to calculate exactly how many millions of dollars Greg owed the woman he dumped in a windowless room. The reality of the secret was completely unraveled. The counterstrike was fully loaded. And when I walked into that probate court, I was going to burn his entire fake empire right down to the stolen dirt it was built on. The morning sun cracked through the broken blinds of my apartment, casting sharp lines of light across the cheap laminate kitchen table. I had not slept a single minute. My eyes were burning and my shoulders ached from sitting in the exact same rigid position for 9 straight hours. Spread out before me were the corporate ledgers, the property deeds, and the master commercial lease agreement my mother had secretly locked away decades ago. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the power of attorney document she had forced me to sign in that miserable nursing home room. Travis realizes that because of the paper Mom signed, he is now the managing director of the LLC. That single stroke of black ink did not just give me permission to speak for her medical care. It handed me the absolute keys to a financial empire that my arrogant brother mistakenly believed belonged entirely to him. I was no longer just a fired logistics manager facing imminent eviction and total bankruptcy. I was the legally recognized head of HV Properties. I was the landlord of the ground Greg walked on. The psychological shift inside my brain felt like a violent physical tremor. For 35 years, I had accepted my role as the quiet, struggling background character of our family. I let Greg parade his wealth, his tailored suits, and his expensive sports cars in my face while I worked 60-hour weeks just to keep a 10-year-old sedan running. I believed him when he called me a failure in the parking lot of that terrible Medicaid facility. I believed his terrible wife, Chloe, when she laughed at my modest income and told me I was completely useless, but sitting in my sweltering apartment, smelling the stale coffee in my mug. I realized they were nothing but parasites, feeding off an old woman they assumed was entirely helpless. Greg stopped paying his commercial rent 5 years ago when the fog of dementia first started clouding our mother's mind. He stole millions of dollars from her own corporation to buy his massive mansion and his custom saltwater pool. I gathered the thick stacks of corporate documents and placed them carefully back into my battered leather briefcase. The court hearing was scheduled for tomorrow morning. Greg had filed an emergency injunction in probate court to declare Helen legally incompetent so he could become her absolute guardian and permanently erase her voice. If he won that hearing, the power of attorney I held would be instantly voided. I would legally absorb the LLC, forgive his own massive commercial debt, and win everything forever. I had to strike before the gavel fell. I washed my face with cold tap water in the cramped bathroom and put on the exact same faded gray suit I had worn to the bank 2 days ago. It was the only suit I owned. It was frayed at the cuffs and tight across the shoulders, but it did not matter anymore. True power was not a tailored navy suit or a midnight black Porsche. True power was the paper sitting in my briefcase. I locked the front door of my apartment, ignoring the bright yellow eviction notice still aggressively taped over my peephole. I did not have a car anymore because the transmission had blown apart on the highway. I did not have money for a taxi. I walked 3 miles through the suffocating morning heat of the city to reach the downtown district. The air was thick with exhaust fumes and the loud grinding noise of construction equipment, but I barely registered any of it. My mind was completely focused on the absolute destruction of my brother's fraudulent kingdom. I did not walk toward the towering glass skyscrapers where the expensive corporate law firms operated. I could not afford a lawyer who charged $500 an hour. I needed a different kind of weapon. I walked past the wealthy financial district and headed straight toward the rundown municipal buildings on the south side of the courthouse square. Travis uses a free legal clinic to draft a commercial lease default and immediate eviction notice. The Community Legal Aid Center was located in the dark basement of an old brick building that smelled of damp concrete and cheap floor wax. The waiting room was already packed with exhausted, desperate people holding folders full of unpaid medical bills and unfair housing complaints. They were people exactly like me. People who had been pushed to the absolute brink by a system designed to crush them, while wealthy men like Greg thrived on their suffering. I took a small paper ticket from the dispenser on the wall and sat down in a hard plastic chair. The number on the ticket was 42. The digital counter above the reception desk read 12. I had to wait. I sat in that plastic chair for 5 grueling hours. My stomach grumbled loudly, reminding me I had not eaten a real meal since the vanilla cupcake I bought for my mother's birthday. I ignored the hunger. I watched young, overworked public defenders and tired paralegals rush back and forth carrying mountains of paperwork. They were fighting an endless war against poverty and injustice with absolutely zero resources. I kept my heavy briefcase resting firmly on my lap, with both hands wrapped tightly around the leather handle. Every time the door opened, I expected to see Greg's expensive corporate lawyers walking in to serve me with another devastating lawsuit. I expected the police to show up and arrest me for some fabricated crime my brother had invented just to remove me from the board. But nobody came. I was entirely invisible down here in the basement, and that was my greatest advantage. Finally, around 2:00 in the afternoon, a tired-looking woman with graying hair and thick reading glasses called my number. She led me to a small, cluttered desk in the back corner of the open office. The desk was covered in empty coffee cups and stacks of thick legal statutes. She introduced herself as Maria, a senior paralegal who had been working at the clinic for 20 years. She looked at my faded suit and the deep, dark circles under my eyes with a practiced expression of sympathetic fatigue. She asked me how she could help me navigate my housing crisis, assuming I was there to fight an unfair residential eviction. I told her I was not there to fight a residential eviction. I told her I was there to initiate a commercial eviction against a corporate tenant who was 3 years in default on a multi-million-dollar land lease. Maria stopped typing on her old computer keyboard and slowly looked up at me over the rims of her glasses. She asked me to repeat what I had just said. I did not raise my voice or try to sound intimidating. I simply opened my leather briefcase and slid the notarized power of attorney document across her cluttered desk. I told her this document granted me absolute administrative control over a private holding company named HV Properties. I then placed the original commercial lease agreement right next to the proxy. I pointed to the specific clause detailing the exact address of the 3 acres of prime commercial real estate where Vance Automotive Group currently operated. I told her the tenant had intentionally and maliciously stopped paying rent over 36 months ago, and I needed the proper legal forms to terminate the lease completely. I watched her eyes widen as she read the flawless legal text my mother had meticulously prepared. She picked up the power of attorney and examined the gold notary seal, verifying the dates and the absolute transfer of power. She then read the commercial lease terms, tracing the enormous financial penalties explicitly outlined for any default exceeding 90 days. Maria leaned back in her squeaky office chair and let out a long breath. She looked at me with a completely new level of intense respect. She told me the paperwork was absolutely bulletproof. She explained that under state commercial property law, I did not need a judge to sign an initial default notice if the termination conditions were explicitly detailed in the original master lease. I possessed the unilateral authority to draft the notice, demand the missing millions, and seize the property. She printed out a stack of blank commercial default templates and handed me a black ink pen. She told me I had to calculate the exact amount of back-owed rent, including the compounding interest penalties, and list it clearly on the front page. I sat at a small wooden table near the water cooler and spent the next hour doing the math. I went through the corporate ledgers month by month, adding up every single dollar Greg had stolen from our mother to fund his luxurious fake lifestyle. He had missed exactly 36 monthly payments of $40,000. That was nearly $1.5 million in base rent alone. When I added the aggressive compounding interest penalties outlined in the lease, the final number was absolutely staggering. Greg owed the LLC over $2.3 million in unpaid rent. I wrote the massive number down on the official legal template. My hand did not shake. I filled in every single blank line with cold, calculated precision. I listed HV Properties as the landlord. I listed Vance Automotive Group as the defaulting tenant. I cited the specific breach of contract clauses and invoked the immediate termination of the 30-year lease agreement. The final paragraph of the notice was the most devastating part of the entire document. It stated clearly that, upon termination, all permanent structures built on the land, including the towering glass showrooms and the massive service centers, legally became the absolute property of the landlord. I was not just demanding the money. I was legally confiscating his entire business. I signed my name at the bottom of the page, proudly adding the title of Managing Director right next to my signature. I brought the completed documents back to Maria's desk. She reviewed my handwriting, making sure every single legal requirement was perfectly satisfied. She stamped the paperwork with the official county date seal, rendering it a legally binding commercial notice. She handed the papers back to me and warned me to be extremely careful. She said corporate tenants with massive financial exposure do not just hand over the keys and walk away quietly. She told me they usually retaliate with vicious lawsuits and aggressive intimidation tactics. I thanked her for her help and placed the signed eviction notice safely into my briefcase. I told her I was completely immune to his intimidation because he had already taken everything else from me. I had absolutely nothing left to lose, and that made me the most dangerous man in the city. I walked out of the basement legal clinic and stepped back into the bright afternoon sunlight. The heat was still brutal, but I felt completely weightless. The crushing exhaustion that had plagued me for the last 3 days was entirely gone. It was replaced by a burning electric adrenaline that surged through my veins. The trap was finally set. The weapon was fully loaded. But I knew I could not just walk up to the car dealership and hand the paper to Greg. If I did that, he would immediately call his expensive lawyers. They would file an emergency stay, tie the eviction up in endless corporate litigation, and use the confrontation as proof in probate court that I was an unstable, hostile brother harassing a successful businessman. He would twist the narrative and use his wealth to bury the truth before a judge ever saw it. I could not give him time to react or strategize. I had to corner him in a place where he could not hide behind his corporate shields or his public relations team. I had to deliver this nuclear financial bomb on the official public record where he was forced to answer for his crimes immediately. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, Greg was going to stand in front of a probate judge and lie under oath. He was going to claim our mother was broke, mentally gone, and a tragic burden. I was going to put on a spectacular performance to win absolute guardianship over her life. He thought that courtroom was going to be the place where he finally destroyed me. He had absolutely no idea that I was going to use his own battlefield against him. I walked toward the towering stone pillars of the county courthouse, located just 2 blocks away from the legal clinic. Travis heads to the courthouse armed not with a defense, but with a nuclear financial weapon. I stood on the massive concrete steps and looked up at the blindfolded statue of Justice, holding the scales on the roof of the building. Greg had spent his entire life tipping the scales in his favor, using manipulation, greed, and absolute arrogance to crush anyone who stood in his way. He pawned the vintage wedding ring of the woman who gave him life, just because he thought she did not need it anymore. He got me fired from my logistics job to ensure I starved on the streets. He built a kingdom on stolen dirt and dared me to challenge him. I gripped the handle of my leather briefcase so tightly, my knuckles turned white. Tomorrow morning, I was going to walk through those heavy brass doors and step into the probate courtroom. I was not going to beg the judge for mercy. I was not going to defensively argue about my mother's mental capacity or my own financial stability. I was going to let Greg tell his beautiful lies. I was going to let him paint his masterpiece of deception right into the court microphone. And then I was going to open my briefcase. I was going to pull out the corporate ledgers, the property deeds, and the signed eviction notice. I was going to prove that his entire life was a monumental fraud and seize his multi-million-dollar empire right in front of the judge. The 48-hour clock was almost up, and my brother was about to lose everything. The heavy brass doors of the county courthouse felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds when I pushed them open on Thursday morning. The air inside the massive stone building was completely different from the suffocating summer heat of the city streets. It was cold and sterile, smelling strongly of lemon polish and ancient paper. The marble floors echoed with the sharp clicking of expensive leather shoes and the low, frantic whispers of desperate people fighting for their lives. I walked through the metal detectors, holding my battered leather briefcase tightly against my chest. I wore my faded gray suit. The collar of my shirt was slightly frayed and my work boots were scuffed, but my spine was perfectly straight. I was walking into the absolute center of my brother's fraudulent kingdom. I took the grand staircase up to the 3rd floor, where the probate courts were located. Every step I took felt deliberate and heavy. My mind was completely clear. The exhaustion that had been crushing my bones for the last 3 days was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, electric focus. I reached the long wooden hallway outside courtroom number 4. The walls were lined with hard wooden benches. Sitting on the center bench, directly under a bright fluorescent light, were Greg and Chloe. They looked like they were shooting a commercial for a luxury lifestyle magazine. Greg wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit that fit his shoulders perfectly. His hair was meticulously styled, and his expensive silver watch caught the harsh overhead light every time he moved his hand. Chloe sat next to him, wearing a pristine black designer dress that was entirely inappropriate for a morning court hearing, but perfectly designed to project absolute wealth. She held a small leather handbag that probably cost more than I made in 6 months at the logistics warehouse. They were leaning close together, whispering and laughing softly about something completely unrelated to the fact that they were here to permanently strip an elderly woman of her fundamental human rights. Greg looked up and saw me standing at the end of the hallway. His laughter immediately stopped. He nudged Chloe and pointed his chin in my direction. They both stared at me with unadulterated contempt. Greg stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket with a practiced, arrogant motion. He walked toward me, his expensive shoes making a soft, confident sound on the marble floor. He stopped a few feet away, looking me up and down with a smirk that made my blood boil. "I am actually surprised you showed up, Travis." Greg said, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet corridor. "I thought you would be too busy packing up your miserable little apartment since you do not have a job anymore. I heard things did not work out for you at the freight yard. Such a shame." I looked him dead in the eyes. I gripped the handle of my briefcase. I did not raise my voice. I did not take the bait. "I am here for our mother, Greg." I replied simply, keeping my tone perfectly flat. Greg let out a short, mocking laugh. He shook his head as if I were a stubborn child who simply could not understand basic reality. "You are here to embarrass yourself," he said, stepping closer until I could smell his expensive cologne. "You have absolutely nothing, Travis. You have no money. You have no lawyer. You are wearing a cheap suit that looks like it came from a dumpster. The judge is going to take one look at you and realize exactly what you are. You are a desperate failure, trying to get your hands on whatever scraps are left of Helen's estate. Do yourself a massive favor and walk away right now before I humiliate you on the public record." I did not move a single muscle. I just stared at his smug, perfectly shaven face. I thought about the 3 acres of prime commercial real estate he was currently leasing from my mother's secret corporation. I thought about the commercial eviction notice, completely finalized and signed, sitting right inside my briefcase. He had absolutely no idea that he was a dead man walking. "We will see what the judge has to say," I said quietly. A heavy wooden door opened behind us, and a uniformed bailiff stepped out into the hallway. The bailiff announced that Judge Harrison was ready to proceed with the emergency guardianship injunction for Helen Vance. Greg rolled his eyes, gave me one last look of absolute pity, and turned around to walk into the courtroom with Chloe clinging to his arm. I took a deep breath, tightened my grip on my briefcase, and followed them inside. The probate courtroom was intimidating by design. The walls were paneled in dark, rich mahogany wood. The ceiling was incredibly high, making anyone standing on the floor feel remarkably small and insignificant. At the front of the room sat the judge's bench, a massive elevated wooden fortress that commanded absolute authority. Greg and Chloe walked straight to the petitioner's table on the right side of the aisle. Waiting for them was a man in a brilliant navy suit with silver hair and a briefcase made of imported Italian leather. This was Greg's high-priced corporate attorney. The lawyer shook Greg's hand enthusiastically and gave Chloe a charming professional smile. I walked alone down the center aisle and took my seat at the respondent's table on the left side. I had no expensive lawyer sitting next to me. I had no paralegal handing me perfectly bound folders. I just placed my battered briefcase on the scarred wooden table and sat down in the hard wooden chair. I could feel the attorney staring at me from across the room. He was undoubtedly evaluating my faded gray suit and calculating exactly how quickly he could destroy me. A heavy door behind the bench opened, and Judge Harrison walked into the room. He was a stern-looking man with deep lines etched around his mouth and sharp, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. The bailiff ordered everyone to rise. We all stood up in complete silence until the judge took his seat and adjusted his black robes. He opened a thick file folder on his desk and looked down at the paperwork. "We are here today regarding an emergency petition for absolute permanent guardianship over the person and estate of Helen Vance, the judge," announced his voice deep and authoritative. "The petitioner is Gregory Vance. The respondent contesting this action is Travis Vance. Counselor, you may proceed with your opening remarks." Greg's attorney stood up immediately. He buttoned his jacket and stepped smoothly up to the wooden podium in the center of the room. He looked at the judge with a practiced expression of deep sorrow and grave concern. "Your Honor," the lawyer began, his voice rich and incredibly persuasive. "We are here today because of a tragedy. Helen Vance is a woman who worked hard her entire life, but unfortunately she has fallen victim to severe and irreversible cognitive decline. She suffers from advanced dementia. She no longer possesses the mental capacity to manage her own finances, understand her medical care, or make rational decisions regarding her daily existence. My client, Gregory Vance, has stepped up as a devoted and successful son to shoulder this massive burden. He has provided for her care and managed her affairs out of pure love. However, his younger brother, Travis Vance, has recently engaged in a pattern of erratic, hostile, and deeply concerning behavior. Travis has attempted to interfere with her medical care using fraudulently obtained documents signed by a woman who does not even know her own name. We are asking this court to declare Helen Vance legally incompetent and grant Gregory Vance absolute permanent guardianship to protect her from further exploitation." The lawyer spoke beautifully. It was a perfectly crafted narrative designed to manipulate the court. He painted Greg as the wealthy, responsible savior, and me as the dangerous, unstable threat. The judge nodded slowly, taking notes on a legal pad. "I will hear testimony from the petitioner," the judge said, looking over his glasses. "Call your first witness." The lawyer turned and gestured gracefully toward my brother. "I call Gregory Vance to the stand." Greg stood up from his table, looking incredibly solemn. He walked up to the witness box, raised his right hand, and swore under oath to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. The absolute hypocrisy of that oath made my stomach churn. He sat down in the wooden chair, adjusting the microphone slightly. He looked directly at the judge, projecting an aura of completely fabricated heartbreak. "Mr. Vance," the lawyer said, pacing slowly in front of the podium, "can you please describe your mother's current mental condition for the court?" Greg let out a long, heavy sigh. He lowered his eyes and his shoulders actually slumped as if the weight of the question was physically painful. "It is devastating, Your Honor," Greg said, his voice cracking perfectly. "My mother is completely gone. The woman who raised me is trapped inside a mind that is failing her. She does not know what day it is. She frequently does not recognize me when I visit her. She hallucinates and becomes incredibly paranoid. She requires constant 24-hour supervision just to ensure she does not wander off and hurt herself. It breaks my heart to see her this way, but I had to accept the reality that she cannot make decisions for herself anymore. I gripped the edge of my table. My mother was sitting in a windowless room, smelling of bleach right now because he put her there. She had moments of confusion, yes, but she also had moments of brilliant, terrifying clarity. She knew exactly what he was doing. And how have you managed her care over the last 2 years? The lawyer asked gently, prompting the next massive lie. Greg looked up, his eyes shining with fake, unshed tears. I have done everything in my power to give her the best life possible, he lied smoothly under oath. When her mind started failing, I realized her personal finances were in complete disarray. She was completely broke, Your Honor. She had absolutely no savings left. So I took it upon myself to fund her care. I used my own personal money from my successful business to place her in a secure medical facility where she receives round-the-clock attention from trained professionals. I pay for everything out of my own pocket because that is what a good son does. The sheer audacity of the perjury was staggering. I stared at him, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. He claimed she was broke. He completely omitted the fact that he had used a shady power of attorney to drain $80,000 from her high-yield savings account. He stole her entire life savings, laundered it into his commercial accounts to pay for his luxury lifestyle, and then dumped her in a free state-run Medicaid facility that cost him absolutely nothing. I was sitting in a court of law, committing massive felony perjury without blinking an eye. Mr. Vance, the lawyer, continued gesturing toward me. Can you explain why your brother Travis is contesting this guardianship? Greg turned his head and looked at me with an expression of deep, manufactured pity. He shook his head sadly. Travis has always struggled, Your Honor. He cannot hold down a stable career. He lives in poverty. He has a lot of resentment toward my financial success. When he found out our mother was sick, he saw an opportunity. He started visiting her facility unannounced, trying to manipulate her while she was confused. A few days ago, he actually forced her to sign a piece of paper, claiming it was a new power of attorney. She does not even know how to read a document anymore, but he put a pen in her hand and took advantage of her dementia. I believe he is desperately trying to gain legal control over her estate so he can liquidate whatever small personal items she has left to pay his own mounting debts. I felt a violent surge of anger rising in my chest. He was projecting his exact crimes directly onto me. He was the one who had walked into her room and stripped her vintage wedding ring right off her finger because he wanted to pawn it. He was the one who liquidated her assets. In fact, Your Honor, Greg added, leaning forward earnestly. Just yesterday, I discovered that one of her most prized possessions, her vintage gold wedding ring, went missing from her room after Travis visited her. I cannot prove he took it, but the timing is incredibly suspicious, given his severe financial desperation. I almost stood up, right then. The absolute sickness of his lies was suffocating. He had confessed to me and Chloe in the parking lot that he pawned the ring for $800. Now he was sitting under oath, accusing me of stealing it to solidify his narrative that I was a dangerous predator. The lawyer nodded sympathetically. Thank you, Mr. Vance. We have no further questions for this witness. The judge looked down from his high bench. His expression was soft when he looked at Greg. He clearly believed every single word of the spectacular performance. The judge saw a wealthy, well-dressed, successful businessman carrying the tragic burden of a sick mother and a hostile, deadbeat brother. Mr. Vance, you may step down, the judge said gently. Greg stood up, smoothed his expensive jacket, and walked back to his table. He sat down next to Chloe, who reached over and patted his hand as if he had just survived a grueling, emotional ordeal. They exchanged a brief, triumphant glance. The judge turned his sharp eyes toward me. The warmth completely vanished from his face, replaced by cold, judicial skepticism. Mr. Travis Vance, you are representing yourself in this matter. Do you have any witnesses you wish to call, or any testimony you wish to offer in defense of these very serious allegations? I stood up slowly. I did not walk up to the podium. I stood right behind my table, resting my hands on the scarred wood right next to my battered leather briefcase. I looked at the judge and then I looked at my brother. Your Honor, I began keeping my voice calm and completely steady, despite the adrenaline pounding in my ears. Everything my brother just said under oath is a complete and total fabrication. He is lying about her mental state. He is lying about her finances, and he is lying about paying for her care. The opposing lawyer stood up immediately, adjusting his perfectly knotted tie. Objection, Your Honor. The respondent is making wild, baseless accusations without a shred of evidence. We have submitted medical evaluations from the state facility documenting her cognitive decline. We have submitted the facility intake forms signed by my client. The judge raised his hand, stopping the lawyer. I will allow the respondent to speak, counselor, but I caution you, Mr. Vance. The judge glared down at me. This court relies on documented facts and verified legal standing. Your brother has presented a very compelling and legally documented case, demonstrating that he is the primary caretaker and financial provider for a woman who is tragically incompetent. You are making very severe allegations of perjury. If you do not have concrete, undeniable evidence to support your claims, I am going to rule immediately in favor of the petitioner. The tension in the courtroom suddenly became incredibly thick. The air felt heavy. The judge buys Greg's story and is about to rule in his favor, preparing to grant Greg full legal control over Helen. The judge was literally holding the wooden gavel in his hand, preparing to bring it down and end my mother's life as a free citizen. He was fully prepared to grant Greg absolute permanent authority, voiding my power of attorney and destroying any chance I had of saving her. Greg leaned back in his chair, crossing his legs comfortably. He looked at me with absolute total victory in his eyes. He knew I could not afford to hire medical experts to refute the dementia claims. He knew I could not subpoena the bank records to prove he stole the $80,000 in the middle of an emergency hearing. He thought he had completely outmaneuvered me. He thought the game was over. But he did not know about the safe deposit box. He did not know about the secrets our mother kept hidden for decades. I reached down and placed my hand on the brass latches of my leather briefcase. The metal was cold against my sweating fingers. The 48 hours of planning of desperation of reading complex legal codes in my sweltering dark apartment all came down to this exact second. I do have evidence. Your Honor, I said. My voice dropping an octave, echoing clearly across the silent mahogany courtroom. I have evidence that proves Gregory Vance is not just committing perjury today. I have evidence that proves his entire life, his entire wealth, and his entire business empire is built on a massive, continuous fraud perpetrated against the very woman he is trying to declare incompetent today. The opposing lawyer let out a loud, dramatic sigh of exasperation. Your Honor, this is absurd. He is wasting the court's time with desperate conspiracy theories. I move that we conclude this hearing and grant the permanent guardianship order immediately. The judge looked at me, his patience clearly exhausted. Mr. Vance, I am giving you exactly 1 minute to produce this so-called evidence, or I am granting the petition and holding you in contempt of court for disrupting these proceedings. I popped the brass latches on my briefcase. The loud metallic clicks echoed like gunshots in the quiet room. I opened the leather flap and reached inside. I did not pull out medical records. I did not pull out emotional letters. I pulled out a stack of pristine, dense corporate real estate documents stamped with official county seals. The counterstrike was fully loaded, and the gavel was suspended in the air. I looked directly at Greg. The smug, confident smile on his face faltered for a fraction of a second as he saw the heavy stack of legal paper in my hands. He did not know what I was holding, but the primal fear of a man who built his life on stolen dirt finally began to show in his eyes. The trap was sprung. The heavy brass latches of my leather briefcase echoed through the silent courtroom like a pair of falling axes. The judge froze with his wooden gavel literally suspended in the cold air above his sounding block. Greg sat rigid at the petitioner's table, his smug smile finally beginning to fracture around the edges. I reached into the dark interior of the briefcase and pulled out the thick stack of pristine corporate real estate documents stamped with official county seals. I did not rush. I let the heavy silence of the room stretch out, magnifying the sudden primal panic flashing in my older brother's eyes. "Your Honor," I said, my voice perfectly steady and echoing against the dark mahogany walls. The petitioner Gregory Vance just sat in that witness box under oath and swore to this court that our mother, Helen Vance, was completely broke. He testified that she had absolutely no assets and that he was graciously funding her care out of his own pocket. He used those claims to justify declaring her legally incompetent so he could seize permanent control of her life. But everything he just said is a calculated, malicious lie designed to cover up the largest financial fraud this county has ever seen. The opposing lawyer jumped to his feet, his face flushed with sudden anger. "Objection, Your Honor," he shouted, pointing a manicured finger at me. The respondent is grandstanding and attempting to introduce unverified conspiracy theories into a simple guardianship hearing. The judge slammed his gavel down once, silencing the lawyer immediately. "You are dangerously close to contempt, Mr. Vance," the judge warned, glaring down at me. "I told you I need concrete, undeniable evidence right this second. What exactly are you holding in your hands?" I stepped out from behind the respondent's table and walked slowly toward the center podium. "I am holding the official state incorporation papers and county property deeds for a private holding company named HV Properties," I explained calmly. This limited liability company was secretly formed 15 years ago by my mother, Helen Vance. She is the sole managing director and the absolute owner of the corporate entity. The judge furrowed his brow, clearly confused by the sudden introduction of corporate law into a probate hearing. He leaned forward, peering over his wire-rimmed glasses. "And what exactly does this holding company possess that is relevant to this guardianship petition?" he asked. I placed the heavy stack of documents directly onto the edge of the judge's elevated bench. I stepped back and looked at Greg. My brother was gripping the edge of his table so hard, his knuckles were entirely white. Chloe had taken off her oversized designer sunglasses and was staring at me with genuine confusion. "The holding company possesses exactly 3 acres of prime commercial real estate located in the Eastern Development Zone," I said, projecting my voice so every single person in the gallery could hear me. "It is highly sought-after land, and the relevance, Your Honor, is the identity of the current corporate tenant who leases that exact piece of land from my mother." The judge picked up the original county deed and flipped to the property description. He read the street address out loud. His eyes widened slightly. He looked up at me and then looked over at Greg. "That is the address of Vance Automotive Group," the judge said, his voice dropping in shock. "That is a massive luxury car dealership." "Yes, Your Honor," I replied. "My mother actually owns the land that Gregory Vance built his entire business on. Greg's entire wealth is a facade. He does not own the land, he leases it from Mom's LLC." A loud gasp erupted from the back of the courtroom. The opposing lawyer dropped his expensive pen onto his table. He turned and looked at Greg with an expression of absolute horror, realizing his wealthy client had lied to him about the fundamental structure of his business. Greg was completely frozen. All the blood had drained from his face, leaving him looking like a pale, terrified ghost. For the first 10 years of the commercial lease, Gregory paid his rent to the LLC. I continued, keeping my gaze locked on the judge. But 5 years ago, my mother began showing the very early signs of memory loss. The fog started rolling in. Greg realized the only person who knew about the corporation was an elderly woman who was becoming forgetful. And Greg, assuming Mom was clueless and helpless, stopped paying rent to the LLC 5 years ago to fund his lavish lifestyle with Chloe. "That is an outrageous lie!" Greg shouted suddenly, standing up and knocking his heavy wooden chair backward onto the marble floor. "She is insane. She does not own anything. I built that dealership with my own money. He is forging documents, Your Honor. You have to arrest him right now." "Order in this court," the judge bellowed, slamming his gavel repeatedly until the echoing cracks forced Greg to sit back down. The judge picked up the master commercial lease agreement I had provided. He adjusted his glasses and spent 2 agonizing minutes reading the specific clauses and verifying the signatures. The silence in the room was suffocating. I could hear the rapid, shallow breathing coming from Chloe's direction. She was staring at Greg with wide, panicked eyes, finally realizing the million-dollar mansion and the saltwater pool were built on stolen ground. These documents appear entirely authentic, the judge said, finally setting the papers down. The state seals are verified. The notary stamps on the lease are flawless. Mr. Gregory Vance, did you or did you not sign a 30-year commercial land lease with HV Properties 15 years ago? Greg opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at his lawyer, begging for help, but the silver-haired attorney physically leaned away from him, wanting absolutely nothing to do with a client who had just committed massive felony perjury in front of a sitting judge. I will remind you that you are currently under oath. Mr. Vance, the judge warned, his voice turning incredibly dangerous. Did you sign this lease? I signed a paper a long time ago. Greg stammered, his voice small and pathetic. But she did not understand what she was doing. It was just a formality for tax purposes. I own the business. I own the buildings. You own the buildings as long as you pay the rent, I interrupted, pulling the second stack of papers from my briefcase. But you defaulted on your commercial lease. You used the money you owed your own mother to buy a Porsche and a luxury mansion while you dumped her in a state-run Medicaid facility that smells like industrial bleach. You claimed she was broke so you could get permanent guardianship and quietly dissolve the LLC before anyone found out you were a fraud. The opposing lawyer stood up, his hands shaking. Your Honor, my firm had absolutely no knowledge of these corporate arrangements. He pleaded desperately, trying to save his own legal license. My client assured us he was the sole owner of all related business assets. The judge ignored the lawyer. He was staring at Greg with a mixture of profound disgust and absolute fury. You sat in my courtroom and swore under oath that you were funding her care out of your own pocket, the judge said softly. You tried to use this court to legally erase your mother's voice so you could cover up your own massive commercial debt. That is perjury. That is financial elder abuse. That is fraud. But she is incompetent, Greg yelled, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. Look at the medical records. She has dementia. She cannot manage a corporation. She cannot legally enforce a lease. I am her guardian. You are not her guardian, I said. I pulled the final document from my briefcase. The power of attorney my mother had secretly signed on her birthday. I walked up and placed it directly in front of the judge. My mother has moments of confusion, yes, I said softly. But she also has moments of brilliant, terrifying clarity. She knew exactly what you were doing, Greg. She knew you were stealing from her. 3 days ago, she secretly executed a new power of attorney and healthcare proxy. It revokes every single right you have over her life and her finances. It grants me absolute administrative control over her estate and HV Properties. The judge inspected the gold notary seal and the fresh date on the signature line. He looked at me and nodded slowly. This proxy is legally binding, he declared. Gregory Vance, you have no authority over Helen Vance. Your petition for emergency guardianship is denied immediately. Greg buried his face in his hands. Chloe let out a loud sob, covering her mouth. But I was not finished. I stepped directly toward the petitioner's table. I did not look at the lawyer. I looked down at my older brother. The man who had mocked my modest income. The man who had stripped a vintage wedding ring off an old woman's finger because he thought she did not need it anymore. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the commercial eviction notice I had drafted at the legal clinic. It was stamped with the official county date seal. Under state commercial property law, I do not need a judge to sign an initial default notice, I said, my voice carrying across the silent room. As the legally recognized managing director of HV Properties, I am serving you right now on the official court record. I dropped the eviction notice directly onto the table in front of him. Greg stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. You are 3 years in default on your commercial lease, I explained coldly. You owe the holding company over $2.3 million in back-owed rent and compounding interest penalties. Because you failed to pay for a period exceeding 90 days, the 30-year lease is officially terminated, effective immediately. Greg's head snapped up. His eyes were bloodshot and wild with panic. "You cannot do this," he whispered. "You cannot evict a multi-million-dollar business. I have inventory. I have employees. I have a brand. Read the fine print of the contract you signed 15 years ago." "Greg," I replied. "Any permanent structures built on the land, including your massive glass showrooms and your pristine service centers, legally become the absolute property of the landlord upon termination of the lease due to default." Greg realizes his entire business is forfeit because he defaulted on the rent, and his $1.2 million lifestyle was built on a lie. "No," Greg screamed, slamming his fists against the table. "You are a pathetic warehouse worker. You cannot take my dealership. I built that empire. It belongs to me. It belongs to Helen Vance," I said. "And you are trespassing on her dirt. You have 48 hours to remove your vehicles from the property before I change the locks on the showroom doors and seize every single asset inside." The absolute reality of his destruction finally crashed down on him. Greg collapsed back into his wooden chair, completely paralyzed by the magnitude of his ruin. He had walked into this courtroom expecting to put the final nail in my coffin. He expected to walk out with absolute control over our mother's life. Instead, he was leaving with absolutely nothing. No business, no money, no empire. Chloe stood up so fast, her chair scraped loudly against the floor. She did not look at Greg with sympathy or support. She looked at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. "You lied to me," she hissed, grabbing her expensive designer handbag. "You told me you owned it all. You are broke." She turned on her heel and marched straight out of the mahogany doors, her high heels clicking sharply against the floor, completely abandoning him the second the money evaporated. Judge Harrison leaned back in his elevated leather chair. He removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked down at Greg with cold judicial authority. Gregory Vance, the judge, said, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "I am forwarding the transcripts of this hearing and all submitted corporate documents directly to the district attorney. You will be investigated for perjury, fraud, and felony elder abuse. I highly suggest you retain criminal defense counsel immediately." The judge slammed his gavel down for the final time. "This hearing is adjourned." I stood in the center of the courtroom, listening to the echoing crack of the wooden gavel. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried on my shoulders for my entire life was completely gone. I gathered my battered leather briefcase and secured the brass latches. I did not say another word to my brother. I turned my back on him and walked down the center aisle. The marble floors felt entirely different under my worn work boots. I pushed the heavy brass doors open and stepped out into the bright afternoon sunlight. I had a long walk ahead of me to get to the Medicaid facility, but I did not mind. I was going to pack my mother's bags. I was going to take her out of that windowless room forever, and then I was going to buy her a brand new cupcake. The heavy mahogany doors of the county probate courtroom closed behind me, sending a loud, echoing thud reverberating down the marble hallway. That sound was the final, definitive end of my older brother's fraudulent empire. The district attorney did not waste a single second after Judge Harrison formally forwarded the hearing transcripts and the massive stack of corporate real estate documents I had submitted into the official public record. Within exactly 48 hours, a massive criminal investigation for felony perjury and financial elder abuse was officially launched against Gregory Vance, the same wealth management executives at First National Bank who had treated me like absolute garbage when I wore my faded gray suit suddenly panicked and desperately tried to cover their own tracks. Greg's assets are frozen due to the perjury and fraud investigation. The bank managers immediately locked every single one of his personal and commercial accounts to distance their institution from the massive public scandal. The sprawling multi-million-dollar luxury dealership was quickly surrounded by bright yellow police tape, while aggressive forensic accountants seized all his computer servers and paper ledgers. Greg desperately tried to hire the most expensive criminal defense lawyers in the city to save himself from prison. But those elite lawyers demanded massive cash retainers up front, and Greg could not pay them because he no longer had access to a single dime of the stolen money. He was completely and permanently locked out of his own kingdom. He had built his entire identity, his massive ego, and his arrogant public persona on the fragile illusion of absolute control and untouchable wealth. Now, he was nothing but a desperate, terrified man facing serious state prison time for maliciously stealing from his own sick mother. The sudden, absolute evaporation of his stolen wealth triggered the immediate and spectacular collapse of his shallow marriage. Chloe immediately packs her bags and leaves him when the money dries up. I heard the pathetic details a few days later from a mutual acquaintance who had the pleasure of witnessing the massive meltdown at their luxury mansion. Chloe did not offer her husband any emotional support or stand by his side during the absolute lowest moment of his entire life. She had married a bank account, and the very second that bank account hit zero, her sacred vows were entirely forgotten. She reportedly ran through the massive vaulted hallways of their custom-built home, grabbing every single piece of expensive designer clothing and luxury jewelry she could carry. She threw her highly expensive leather handbags into a dozen premium suitcases and called a private luxury car service to take her away. Greg supposedly stood in the grand foyer of his sprawling empty house, begging her to stay and frantically promising her he would find a sneaky legal loophole to get the money back. She just laughed in his face. She looked at him with the exact same cold, unadulterated disgust she had previously shown me in the nursing home parking lot. She walked right out the front door, climbed into the back of a black town car, and left him standing entirely alone in a hollow mansion that he was inevitably going to lose to the bank foreclosures. Poetic justice is a quiet but incredibly absolute force that always balances the scales in the end. But my primary focus was never about watching my brother suffer or celebrating his massive downfall. My only mission in this entire brutal ordeal was saving the beautiful woman who had sacrificed everything for our survival. With the commercial lease officially terminated due to his intentional default, I worked alongside a legitimate corporate attorney to legally seize the physical assets of the automotive dealership. We quickly liquidated a substantial portion of the commercial vehicle inventory to immediately extract the $2.3 million in back-owed rent and compounding interest penalties that Greg had stolen from the holding company. The very first thing I did with those recovered corporate funds was drive my battered 10-year-old sedan straight back to that miserable state-run Medicaid facility. I walked down that flickering fluorescent hallway, smelling of industrial bleach and deep, terrifying neglect for the absolute last time in my life. I pushed open the heavy wooden door to room 114 and told my mother we were finally going home. Travis uses the back-owed rent seized from Greg's business accounts to move Helen into a beautiful, private, assisted living home. The new premium care facility was a brilliant masterpiece of human compassion and genuine medical care. It was located on a sprawling green country estate filled with ancient oak trees and massive blooming flower gardens. Her new personal room was incredibly spacious, with huge glass windows that let the warm golden sunlight pour across her soft bed every single morning. She had a beautiful private balcony where she could sit securely and listen to the birds sing while drinking hot tea. The nursing staff were incredibly kind, deeply patient, and highly trained in advanced neurological memory care. When I brought her into the new sunny room for the very first time, she sat down in a comfortable plush armchair and looked out the bright window with tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. The terrible fog in her mind still came and went as the days passed, but the crushing, terrifying fear was completely gone from her eyes. She was finally safe, and she was surrounded by the absolute highest level of dignity and respect that she rightfully deserved. My own life also transformed in ways I had never dared to imagine during those long, grueling years of just trying to survive. He secures a new, higher-paying job using the legal and management skills he proved during the ordeal. I did not go back to the dusty shipping warehouse. I did not return to managing freight logistics for arrogant corporate executives who constantly looked down on me and treated me like a replaceable machine. Navigating the complex labyrinth of commercial real estate law, auditing corporate ledgers, and fighting aggressive legal battles in probate court had fundamentally changed my perspective on my own capabilities. I had discovered a deep analytical strength and a fierce capacity for high-level corporate strategy that I never even knew I possessed. A highly respected commercial estate management firm in the downtown financial district had heard the incredible rumors about the way I systematically dismantled a fraudulent multi-million-dollar commercial lease without a single expensive lawyer in my corner. The senior partners called me in for an extensive interview, and they were absolutely blown away by my meticulous understanding of corporate property rights and asset recovery. They immediately offered me a senior executive position as a commercial asset director. They handed me a beautiful corner office with a view of the city skyline and an annual salary that completely revolutionized my financial existence. I finally moved out of my sweltering, cramped apartment on the dangerous south side of town and bought a modest but beautiful brick house with a large green backyard. I finally had the solid financial stability and the deep personal respect I had worked so incredibly hard to earn for 35 years. I visit my mother every single Sunday afternoon without fail. We sit together in the bright, sunny courtyard of her beautiful assisted living home, and we eat fresh vanilla cupcakes with pink frosting exactly the way she loves them. During my very first week at the new corporate job, I spent 3 entire days tracking down the shady downtown pawn shop where Greg had maliciously sold her vintage gold wedding ring for $800. I walked into that dark store, slammed $3,000 in cash onto the glass counter, and bought the priceless family heirloom back. I drove straight to the care facility and placed that beautiful, simple gold band right back onto her left ring finger where it truly belongs. She looks at that small, imperfect diamond every single day and smiles with a deep, comforting recognition. Travis reflects on how true wealth is not the car you drive, but the integrity you keep. My older brother chased the empty, shiny illusion of status and completely destroyed his own soul in the relentless process. He eagerly traded his basic humanity and his family loyalty for a midnight black luxury sports car and a custom saltwater swimming pool. I is currently awaiting his criminal trial, living in a cheap rundown motel on the edge of the city, while his entire fraudulent empire is dismantled piece by the state authorities. I learned the hardest and most painful way possible that the cruel labels toxic people try to place on you do not define your actual reality. They will loudly call you a pathetic failure and a worthless loser just to desperately protect their own fragile, insecure egos. They will constantly try to convince you that you are entirely powerless because they are absolutely terrified of what you might actually accomplish if you ever realize your true inherent strength. True, incredible power is standing your ground completely alone when everyone else in the room tells you to surrender. True, unshakable power is fighting for the innocent people you love, even when you have absolutely nothing left to lose in the world. He delivers a strong call to action, asking the audience to share their own stories of standing up to toxic family members. If you are watching this right now, and you have ever been pushed into a dark corner by a toxic, manipulative family member who arrogant thought they could walk all over you, I want to hear directly from you. Please share your own personal stories of fighting back and standing up for your human dignity in the comments section below. Let us use this space to proudly remind each other that we are never as weak or as powerless as those toxic people want us to believe. Do not forget to gently hit the like button on this video and firmly subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories about surviving deep betrayal, finding your hidden strength, and finding the ultimate courage to finally take back your beautiful life.